If you say the name Salem out loud, most minds move immediately toward the same narrow picture: a cluster of frightened girls, a courtroom that mistook accusation for proof, dark clothing, October storefronts, black-hatted silhouettes, and a town fixed forever inside a single season of fear. It is an image so familiar that it can begin to feel complete, as if the story were already finished before it even begins. And yet the Salem that survives in the popular imagination is only one small chamber inside a much larger house. Beneath the famous panic lies a deeper place made of salt air, winter fields, warped floorboards, trade ledgers, family quarrels, raw judicial power, and the long afterlife of events that were never entirely put to rest. Tonight, there is no need to hurry toward the loudest version of the story. We can move more slowly than that. We can let the harbor quiet down, let the tour groups fade, let the modern signs and windows recede until the town becomes less like a backdrop and more like a layered surface. The Salem of memory does not sit still. It shifts depending on where you stand. From one corner, it is a port city looking outward to the world. From another, it is a rural village haunted by suspicion and weather and the fragile mechanics of authority. From another still, it is a place where the ground remembers what the brochures once did not, where the names attached to famous events drift between legend and record, and where even the locations of suffering can move across generations before the landscape quietly insists on being read again. That may be one of Salem's strangest qualities. It is not merely a town with a dark history. It is a town that keeps changing the shape of its own past. Stories settle there, but they never settle completely. One century gives the town one meaning. The next century adds another. A later generation restores a house, uncovers a grave, revises a plaque, or looks again at a hill that people thought they already understood. The result is not a clean timeline moving neatly from ignorance to knowledge. It is something more unsettled than that. Salem becomes, over and over, a place where memory is edited in public, where the familiar version of events often turns out to be the shallowest one, and where what most people recognize first is not always what matters most. So instead of beginning with the moment Salem became famous, it helps to begin with the sensation of standing there after the fame has exhausted itself. Imagine the town after evening. The shop windows are dimming. The harbor holds the last light in flat gray bands. Wood creaks somewhere inside an old house built for trade rather than tourism. The air smells faintly of salt and stone. In that hour, Salem feels less like a performance and more like a place that has outlived many explanations. The famous trials are still there, of course, but they stop behaving like the whole story. They become one layer among older and newer layers. Puritan belief, coastal ambition, village resentment, imperial instability, maritime fortune, literary inheritance, preservation, excavation, and the uneasy modern habit of turning pain into destination. Once you begin to see Salem that way, the town changes. The witch trials are no longer a sealed box labeled 1692. They become a pressure point where many older anxieties converged. They become part of a broader landscape of fear and authority that stretched beyond the courtroom and beyond the year itself. The roads leading into the village mattered. The war along the main frontier mattered. The weather mattered. The breakdown of political certainty mattered. The fact that Salem Village and Salem Town did not entirely want the same future mattered. Even the ordinary things mattered. Who lived near whom, who owned land, who prayed under which minister, who distrusted which neighbor, who had already learned to hear danger in every unusual event. This is the quieter way into Salem. Not as a theater of sudden madness, but as a place where older tensions accumulated slowly until a society that believed itself orderly could no longer tell the difference between piety and cruelty. A place where paper records multiplied even as reason thinned out. A place where the names of the dead would travel farther than the names of the judges who failed them. A place where later generations would keep returning, searching not only for what happened, but for what else had been hidden beneath what happened. There is another reason to start here, in this gentler, widening frame. When a place becomes famous for one thing, that one thing begins to cast a long shadow over everything else. Salem's harbor, its warehouses, its shipbuilders, its meeting houses, its family farms, its burial traditions, its literary descendants, even its silence, can all seem secondary once the trials take over the imagination. But the town was never made from one story alone. It was formed from land and water, from trade and doctrine, from buildings meant to last and judgments that should never have lasted at all. The famous tragedy did not descend onto an empty stage. It grew from a living place full of structures already under stress. If you listen closely, Salem almost prefers to be approached that way. Not through the loudest image first, but through textures. Harbor water touching stone. Wind moving across a field that used to belong to a family whose name still carries weight. A cramped room where accusation would once have sounded final. A memorial placed in a neighborhood where ordinary houses now stand near an execution site once misplaced in public memory. A preserved home where a body may or may not have returned in secret, and where the uncertainty itself has become part of the story. These are not simply historical details. They are the town's storytelling buttons, the quiet hinges that open deeper doors. Salem's real power has never come only from the fact that something terrible happened there. Many places contain suffering. Salem's power comes from the way suffering fused with myth, and myth fused with architecture, and architecture fused with tourism, and tourism fused with scholarship, until the town became a layered archive of how America remembers what it would rather simplify. The familiar version tells you that Salem is about witches. The slower version tells you that Salem is about evidence, fear, performance, class, theology, empire, weather, property, memory, and the long human need to force chaos into story. The slower version is nearly always the stranger one. So tonight, we will take that slower path. We will move through Salem, not as if it were a single tale, but as if it were a series of rooms lit one by one. We will begin with the image everyone knows, and then let the walls expand. We will step beyond the postcard of witchcraft into the older conflicts between town and village, authority and panic, harbor and hinterland. We will follow the stories into meeting houses, prison cells, counting houses, memorial stones, family farms, and wharves that once linked a New England port to distant parts of the world. We will let the record speak where it can, and where the record grows thin, we will notice that thinness rather than hide it. In Salem, what cannot be confirmed often remains almost as important as what can. For that is one of the town's forgotten mysteries too. Not every secret is a hidden fact waiting to be uncovered. Some secrets endure because history leaves behind only partial light. A body may be moved in the dark and remembered only through family tradition. A last phrase may be repeated so often that it hardens into legend while the documents remain more restrained. A famous hill may carry a public name for generations before scholars, archives, and landscape together point somewhere slightly lower, slightly less dramatic, and more true. Salem teaches this lesson again and again. It asks to be read carefully, not because truth is absent, but because truth there is often buried under repetition. Perhaps that is why the town remains so difficult to exhaust. You can know the outline of the trials and still know almost nothing about Salem. You can recognize the names and still miss the geography. You can visit the attractions and still overlook the harbor that made the place wealthy, the village tensions that made it brittle, and the afterlives that made it famous in ways no one living there in 1692 could have imagined. The town people think they know is often the thinnest layer of all. Tonight we will go beneath it, quietly. We will let the myths stay in view, but not in command. We will walk more slowly than the crowd. We will listen for the difference between the town that markets a story and the landscape that keeps revising it. And if, by the end, Salem feels less familiar than it did at the beginning, that may only mean we have come a little closer to the place itself. 2. Before the panic, a split community by water and soil. Long before Salem became shorthand for judicial hysteria, it was already a divided place. That division was not always theatrical. It did not announce itself with flames or public declarations. More often, it lived in arrangements of distance, livelihood, worship, and status. Salem town, closer to the harbor and the rhythms of commerce, faced outward. Ships connected it to wider markets and wider ambitions. The waterfront brought money, information, cargo, rumor, and the habit of thinking in terms larger than the next harvest. Salem Village, by contrast, was more rural, more agricultural, more dependent on the texture of inland life. Fields, fences, woodlots, local resentments, and the difficult mathematics of subsistence shaped daily experience there. The two places were related, but not identical. Over time, their differences became more than geographical. It is tempting to imagine the old world in simple blocks, as though all Puritans believed the same things in the same way and all settlements shared the same priorities. Salem resists that simplification. Even within a society publicly committed to order and doctrine, fractures deepened. By the 1670s, tensions between Salem Village and Salem Town had become increasingly visible. Part of the strain was economic. A prosperous town tied to trade could not help but develop differently from a farming village concerned with land, inheritance, labor, and dependence on local authority. Part of the strain was administrative and religious. The village wanted greater local independence, including control over its own worship. When it formed its own church and installed a minister, that achievement did not resolve conflict. In some ways, it sharpened it. A meeting house is easy to romanticize from a distance. In modern imagination, it can look austere but stable, a simple wooden building around which communal life gathered in a spirit of stern agreement. In truth, a meeting house could also be a container for fracture. It held doctrine, yes, but also arguments about who belonged, who obeyed, whose piety counted, and whose grievances were treated as dangerous rather than righteous. Salem Village's effort to establish its own religious center reflected a desire for self-definition, but self-definition rarely comes without cost. A community trying to explain itself to itself can become unusually sensitive to deviance, unusual behavior, and perceived disrespect. In a world where spiritual order and social order were thought to mirror one another, any disruption risked feeling larger than itself. So when later generations look backward and ask how the trials could have happened, the answer begins not with a single spark, but with a community already living among dry materials. The split between town and village mattered because it trained people to think in oppositions. Prosperity and resentment, reach and dependence, urban influence and rural suspicion. To live inside such a landscape was to inhabit a place where belonging was not evenly distributed. Some families were more secure. Some voices counted more than others. Some locations drew the flow of goods and information, while others absorbed the aftershocks. Even before panic took hold, Salem's geography was quietly teaching its residents where power tended to settle and where unease tended to gather. This matters because panic seldom emerges from nowhere. It likes fault lines. It moves through communities that already know how to divide themselves. And Salem's divisions were not abstract. They could be felt in the time it took to travel, in the condition of roads, in the nearness or farness of neighbors, in the contrasting views of what kind of future the area should have. One part of the community was tied more directly to mercantile promise. Another was vulnerable to more intimate pressures, failed crops, overwork, old resentments, and the disciplinary intimacy of village life. When people in such a place claimed to see evidence of invisible evil, they were not importing anxiety into an otherwise contented world. They were giving spiritual shape to pressures that already saturated daily existence. Leadership mattered too, which in moments of uncertainty can either absorb fear or amplify it. Salem Village's minister, Samuel Parris, has often been remembered as one of the severe presences in the background of the crisis. The details of his role are inseparable from the broader fact that the village had already been struggling over religious identity and authority. To appoint a minister is one thing. To agree on what that minister represents is another. A controversial figure in a divided place can become a kind of tuning fork for collective unease. Every sermon sounds louder. Every theological warning lands closer to home. Every private tension begins to borrow the language of public righteousness. At the same time, the broader colonial setting was unstable in ways easy to forget if Salem is viewed too narrowly. This was not a serene village that suddenly descended into irrationality because of isolated local quirks. New England in the early 1690s was living under strain. Political authority had been shaken. The old Massachusetts charter had been revoked in the years before the crisis, and colonial governance had been unsettled. In practical terms, that meant people lived with weakened trust in how power was organized and enforced. A society that believes divine order and political order are linked is especially vulnerable when the structure of authority becomes uncertain. Disorder above invites fear below. Political uncertainty was not merely constitutional. War along the northern frontier, especially the conflicts involving the English, the French, and indigenous allies in Maine, helped create an atmosphere in which violence felt near, even when it was not physically present in the village every day. Refugees and stories from the frontier could carry terror into inland communities. The line between rumor and warning blurred. People learned to imagine danger approaching from outside while also searching for signs of betrayal within. That combination is potent. A community taught to fear invasion and judgment at once can become intensely receptive to invisible enemies. Then add hardship of a more intimate kind: smallpox, severe weather, failed rhythms of ordinary security. Sources from the period describe the years around the trials as marked by extreme conditions, including drought and cold. It is easy, from the distance of climate-controlled modern life to underestimate what such hardship does to social feeling. Long winters, poor harvests, illness, and repeated stress do not mechanically cause persecution, but they alter the atmosphere in which people interpret misfortune. When bodies are already exhausted and households already strained, explanations that promise moral clarity can become dangerously attractive. Salem's later fame tends to flatten these elements into background, as though they were merely contextual notes beneath the main event. But the background was the event's true architecture. The village-town divide, the struggle over religious authority, the uncertainties of governance, the pressures of frontier war, the bodily experience of disease and weather, the habits of suspicion produced by a world that saw the devil as active in history. These were not decorations around the trials. They were the conditions that made the trials thinkable. Even today, Salem still contains traces of that older split, though not always where a visitor first looks. The harbor remains a reminder that the town's identity was once inseparable from outward movement, from exchange, from ambition shaped by ships and ledgers. Inland sites associated with the village and the trials preserve another world entirely, one of farm boundaries, meeting house authority, and a social order vulnerable to internal fracture. To move between those landscapes, even now, is to sense that Salem was never one coherent stage. It was already a series of competing emotional climates. That is part of what makes the place so compelling. The terror of 1692 did not happen in a vacuum, but in a zone where different ways of living had begun to press against each other. The harbor taught one rhythm. The village taught another. One looked to the world. The other monitored itself. One made fortunes from distant exchange. The other managed closeness and scarcity. Between those two rhythms lay a tension that never needed to announce itself dramatically, because everyone already lived inside it. If you stand with that long enough, Salem starts to feel less like a sudden rupture and more like a chamber filling slowly with pressure. Each dispute about church governance, each unease about status, each report from the frontier, each illness, each cold season, each failure of authority added another quiet turn of the screw. The witch trials would later provide the explosion everyone remembers. But the mystery worth noticing first is how much of the force had been building in silence. Another lesson emerges here. What destroys a community is not always the loud event itself. Sometimes it is the long apprenticeship to division that comes before the event, the years in which a place learns how to mistrust, how to sort the righteous from the suspect, how to turn geography into temperament. By the time accusations began, Salem was already practiced in the emotional habits that would let accusation feel plausible. The town people remember for its courtroom horrors was, before that, a study in distance. Distance between harbor and field, prosperity and vulnerability, confidence and grievance, public doctrine and private resentment. Those distances were small enough to cross physically, but large enough to shape consciousness. They are part of what made Salem dangerous to itself. 3. A world that believed the invisible was real. To understand Salem at all, you have to step into a mental world that no longer comes naturally to most modern people. It is not enough to know that the colonists believed in witches. The belief has to be restored to its original scale. In their world, the invisible was not metaphorical. The devil was not a poetic device or a figure of speech. Providence, judgment, temptation, affliction, and spiritual warfare were woven into the explanation of daily life. To live in such a world was to assume that unseen forces could enter ordinary events at any moment. A sick animal, a child's strange behavior, a run of bad luck, a sudden quarrel, an unexpected death, a sequence of failed crops. None of these existed in a spiritually neutral field. Such a claim does not mean everyone was equally credulous, nor that every resident of New England moved through life in a state of feverish supernatural expectation. Human beings remain complex even in rigid cultures, but the baseline assumptions were radically different from ours. Salem's people did not have to leap from reason into fantasy when accusations arose. They were moving within a cosmology that had already made room for active evil. The question was rarely whether invisible agency existed. The question was where it was operating, through whom, and with what signs. This distinction matters, because modern retellings often make the past feel foolish in a way that ends inquiry too quickly. If Salem becomes merely the story of backward people believing absurd things, then the deeper mechanisms vanish. The crisis was not produced by simple ignorance. It was produced by a disciplined culture of interpretation. People had learned to read the world morally. They had been taught that outward events could reveal hidden states, that suffering might indicate spiritual threat, and that communities remained vulnerable not only to visible enemies but to corruption working from within. Such habits of interpretation can be devastating precisely because they are organized, serious, and reinforced by authority. Puritanism, in this respect, created both order and peril. It gave people a framework, a sense that life belonged to a coherent divine drama in which nothing happened meaninglessly. That can be consoling when times are stable. It can be catastrophic when times are not. Under strain, the same worldview that once steadied a community can make fear feel sacred. If affliction is a sign, then strange symptoms demand explanation. If the devil seeks entry, then disorder must have an agent. If a people believe themselves covenant-bound, then misfortune may not look random at all. It may look like evidence that someone, somewhere, has opened a door. You can almost feel how seductive that would be in a season of uncertainty. The frontier is unstable. Governance is unstable. Weather is erratic. Illness moves through households. Old resentments have not healed. In such a world, ambiguity becomes exhausting. A spiritual explanation offers relief of a certain kind. It says the chaos is not meaningless. It says what is happening belongs to a pattern. It says one might still regain control if only the hidden source of corruption can be identified and removed. The danger, of course, is that once a culture begins demanding moral explanations for complex suffering, people themselves start to become the evidence. A glance, a quarrel, an inconvenience, a reputation, a dream, a fit, a rumor. Anything may be conscripted into narrative. The invisible needs visible carriers, and communities under pressure are often ready to provide them. In Salem, the afflicted girls have long stood at the center of this story, partly because their behavior gave the crisis its apparent immediacy. But even their symptoms only mattered because adults, ministers, magistrates, and neighbors inhabited a world prepared to classify such symptoms within a moral and supernatural frame. The girls did not act in an interpretive vacuum. The culture around them had already written a script for invisible assault. Once that script took hold, each new allegation could seem to confirm the worldview that produced it. This is also why popular attempts to explain the trials through a single material cause often feel unsatisfying. From time to time, theories have suggested poisoned bread, disease, or other medicalized explanations for certain behaviors. But such theories, however intriguing, cannot account for the full social reality of the crisis. Even if one isolated symptom could be reinterpreted chemically or neurologically, the trials themselves were larger than symptoms. They were a collective act of belief, procedure, testimony, authority, and fear. They were made possible by a society whose moral imagination had already normalized the search for invisible enemies. Just as important, the invisible in Salem was not only demonic, it was also social. Reputation moved through the town in ways you could not see but could certainly feel. Old conflicts did not disappear simply because they were not publicly declared every day. Family alliances, grievances, theological leanings, and inherited impressions formed an unseen map beneath the visible one. So when accusations appeared, they traveled not just through doctrine, but through social memory. One person's piety could be another person's severity. One person's eccentricity could become another person's suspicion. Invisible structures of feeling worked alongside invisible spiritual fears. For that reason, Salem's records can feel at once alien and familiar. The language belongs to another century, but the mechanisms are recognizable. People interpret partial evidence through pre-existing fear. Communities seek certainty in narratives that simplify complexity. Authorities mistake confidence for truth. Social division gives moral accusation extra force. The particulars are Puritan, colonial, and intensely local. The pattern is more enduring than anyone would like. Still, it is worth lingering inside the difference rather than rushing to modern parallels. Imagine the candlelight in a room where testimony is being heard. Imagine how thin the walls might feel between heaven, earth, and hell. Imagine how words like covenant, judgment, providence, and temptation would not sound archaic there, but immediate. Imagine the bodily reality of affliction in a time without modern medicine, the emotional reality of praying for order in a season of instability, the communal reality of living where everyone's conduct could potentially become everyone else's concern. In such a world, invisible evil is not a fantasy layered on top of reality. It is part of reality's accepted structure. Even so, Salem's mystery deepens here rather than resolves. Because if the worldview helps explain how the trials became possible, it does not remove the moral shock of what followed. Belief alone does not inevitably produce cruelty. Many societies have believed in unseen forces without building a machine of accusation that killed 25 innocent people across 1692 and 1693, most by hanging, one by pressing, and others by dying in prison. Something in Salem's specific arrangement of theology, fear, local tension, authority, and procedure turned belief into lethal action. Procedure deserves attention too. The court did not behave as though it were abandoning order. Quite the opposite. One of the most chilling features of Salem is how administrative the panic became. The crisis produced complaints, warrants, examinations, imprisonment, testimony, and formal process. Evil was not merely shouted about in the street. It was documented, written down, stamped by authority. The moral imagination of the invisible entered the bureaucracy of the visible. Paper gave fear a scaffold. Here, Salem stops being only a story about superstition and becomes a story about institutions. A culture that believes the invisible is real may still protect itself with evidentiary restraint, humility, or skepticism. Salem did not. Or rather, for a terrible stretch, enough of its authorities failed to do so. Spectral claims, personal testimony, and public pressure entered a legal environment already weakened by larger instability. The result was not random frenzy, but organized catastrophe. Perhaps the deepest unease Salem leaves behind. Not that people believed strange things, but that the strange things became actionable through procedure. The meetinghouse world of doctrine merged with the courtroom world of enforcement. Fear crossed the threshold into law. Once that happened, the invisible was no longer merely believed. It was administered. In later centuries, Americans would return to Salem, partly to reassure themselves that they had outgrown such a world. But Salem resists offering that comfort too easily. The details change from era to era. The language of invisible threat changes. The sanctioned authorities change. The instruments of proof change. Yet the appetite to transform uncertainty into accusation remains one of the most persistent features of collective life. Salem's Puritan cosmology may seem distant, but the emotional grammar of fear remains less distant than we might prefer. For now, though, let us stay with the older world a little longer. A world of candles and sermons, of raw weather and moral interpretation, of households that read affliction as a message, of magistrates who believed themselves responsible not only for order, but for the defense of a godly community against hidden corruption, of villagers already trained to suspect that what could not be seen might still be decisive. In that world, once panic began, it would not feel to many like a break from reality. It would feel like reality suddenly revealing its truest face. 4. When fear learned to use paper. There is something peculiarly unsettling about the fact that Salem's panic did not remain a mood. It became a paperwork event. Complaints were filed, warrants were issued, examinations were conducted, imprisonment followed, testimony accumulated. The crisis moved not only through whispers and fits, but through ink, signatures, formulas, offices, and the hardening habits of official process. If fear had stayed private, Salem might still have suffered terribly. But when fear learned to use paper, it discovered how to outlast the moment that produced it. We tend to imagine hysteria as noisy, uncontrolled, visibly chaotic. Salem reminds us that hysteria can also become tidy. It can sit at a table. It can ask questions in sequence. It can speak in the language of duty. It can convert trembling uncertainty into a procedural rhythm that feels almost calm from one step to the next. That is part of what made the crisis so lethal. The machinery of law did not interrupt panic. For a time, it gave panic a body. Think of the transformation this required. A suspicion begins as something nearly shapeless. Someone says a child is afflicted, another reports strange behavior, another remembers an old quarrel, another suggests a troubling reputation. None of this, by itself, looks like the stuff of a state response. Yet once magistrates entertain the framework, once a complaint is accepted, once a warrant exists, everything changes. The community is no longer merely fearing evil. It is processing it. And process has a way of generating confidence. Each document implies precedent. Each examination implies seriousness. Each confinement implies risk. A person who has been arrested begins to look arrestable in retrospect. A person who has been named begins to seem already halfway translated into guilt. The more the system acts, the more its action appears to justify itself. That loop, between official intervention and public conviction, is one of Salem's darkest mechanisms. Trial documents have survived in ways that make this mechanism almost painful to watch. They show a society not merely losing its reason, but laboring to formalize what reason should have rejected. The horror is not hidden behind missing evidence. Much of it exists in the evidence itself. A community with writing, law, religious seriousness, and institutional self-respect still found ways to turn accusation into administrative fact. Perhaps that is why the surviving records feel so cold. Human voices are there, certainly, but often filtered through formulas. Names appear, dates appear, orders appear. Yet beneath the stillness of the language, you can sense the emotional chaos it organized. A warrant does not record the sleeplessness of the person taken into custody. A deposition does not hold the smell of the room where it was spoken. An examination does not capture the social terror of being stared at by neighbors who have already learned to treat fear as evidence. Paper cleans the surface of events, even while preserving their violence. Any historian looking back confronts a strange paradox. The trials are documented, but documentation does not necessarily bring clarity. It can bring detail without justice, form without truth. In Salem, writing did what institutions often hope writing will do. It made action legible. But legibility is not the same as wisdom. A record can preserve error with perfect precision. This helps explain why Salem's archive remains both invaluable and unbearable. The legal records are among the strongest tools later generations possess for understanding the crisis. They allow scholars to reconstruct names, dates, movements, accusations, and procedures. They keep the victims from dissolving entirely into folklore. And yet the same records also reveal how power authenticated fear. A community that wrote so much still failed so badly. There is a modern temptation to assume that good record-keeping protects against moral catastrophe. Salem is one of the places that exposes the weakness of that assumption. Records are tools. They reflect the structure of the system producing them. If the system is distorted, the record may simply preserve distortion more efficiently. A false accusation written carefully does not become less false. A legal form filled out solemnly does not become less cruel because its lines are straight. Still, the paper mattered. It mattered in 1692 because it allowed the crisis to spread and stabilize. It matters now because it allows memory to resist complete invention. When later myths attach themselves too confidently to certain events, the archive can sometimes answer back. Not always fully, not always cleanly, but enough to remind us that Salem is not pure legend. It is a documented disaster. That distinction becomes especially important in a town so heavily mediated by tourism and repetition. The more often a story is told, the more likely it is to simplify itself. Details blur into mood. Mood turns into branding. Branding invites performance. Salem could easily have been lost to atmosphere alone if so many records had not endured. The papers do not eliminate myth, but they keep myth from ruling without resistance. It is worth imagining those papers not as abstractions, but as physical objects. Folded sheets. Ink gone slightly brown. Edges worn. Names written by hands that could not have known how famous or infamous those names would become. Somewhere in their making is a quieter tragedy too, the confidence of ordinary procedure. The people drafting and filing such records were not writing with the dramatic self-awareness later generations would bring to them. They were doing official work. It is precisely that ordinary quality which unsettles. Bureaucratic evil rarely thinks of itself as theatrical. Salem's legal machinery had another consequence. It redistributed fear across time. A shouted accusation vanishes into air. A written complaint survives. A prison order extends suffering beyond the moment of charge. A deposition can haunt a family after the speaker is gone. In that sense, paper not only registered panic, it lengthened it. It gave the crisis a future. Perhaps this is part of why Salem still feels close. The trials are not preserved only in imagination, but in files. The town's sorrow sits in archives as well as on memorials. Its afterlife depends not just on ghost stories or October reenactments, but on actual records that continue to be read, transcribed, contested, and returned to. That labor of rereading is itself part of Salem's mystery, a place where the paperwork of injustice became one of the primary means by which later generations learned to name the injustice at all. A more merciful society might have left behind fewer such papers because it would have stopped sooner. Salem left many because it did not. The archive is therefore both wound and witness. It shows how readily authority can place its seal upon fear. It also makes forgetting harder than simplification would prefer. If you were to picture the town in that season, Do not imagine only fits and outcries. Imagine tables, benches, quills, clerks, magistrates, folded orders, prison spaces filling one after another. Imagine the emotional distance paper can create even while bodies continue to suffer. This was not chaos without administration. It was chaos passing through administration and coming out with greater force. That is one of the reasons Salem still resists becoming merely picturesque. The town is full of old wood and old stone, of handsome facades and preserved rooms, but at its center lies this bureaucratic lesson. A society does not need to abandon structure to commit wrong. Sometimes it commits wrong through structure, through the solemn confidence of process carried out in the wrong moral weather. When fear learned to use paper in Salem, the town crossed a threshold. It ceased to be a place merely anxious about invisible evil. It became a place capable of arresting, confining, trying, and killing under the sign of that anxiety. The record remains. The pages do not tremble. That is left to us. 5. Rebecca Nurse and the mystery of a body carried home. Among the names bound forever to Salem, Rebecca Nurse carries a particular kind of sorrow. There are figures in the trials whose reputations in the historical imagination burn brightly because of confrontation, rhetoric, or dramatic death. Rebecca Nurse is remembered differently. Her presence enters the story with the force of moral contradiction. She was an elderly woman, a respected member of the community, and by many accounts, not the sort of person later generations would expect to find at the center of a witchcraft accusation. Her case has long unsettled people because it shows how little innocence protected a person once the machinery of suspicion had begun to move. To think about Rebecca Nurse is to think not only about accusation, but about place. Her homestead, in present-day Danvers, preserves one of the most intimate surviving connections to the trials, the only publicly open home of a person executed during the crisis. That fact alone changes the way one imagines Salem's history. So much of the story can feel dispersed across documents and memorials, but here, the domestic world presses close again. There was a house. There was land. There were paths worn by ordinary feet. There was work to be done, meals to be prepared, seasons to be endured. Before Rebecca Nurse became a symbol, she lived somewhere. The property itself carries long layers. The larger tract once extended across hundreds of acres. The house, a traditional saltbox structure associated with the Nurse family, sits within grounds that now include a reproduction of the Salem Village meeting house, where many early hearings connected to the witchcraft hysteria took place. Even this arrangement feels almost dreamlike in the quiet way Salem often does. Domestic life and public judgment sit near one another. Home and accusation occupy the same emotional field. A woman can move, in memory, from hearth to hearing room and back again, though not in the life that history gave her. Beyond the house lies the cemetery. The Rebecca Nurse homestead includes the Nurse family burial ground, and with it, one of Salem's most enduring, restrained mysteries. Family tradition holds that after Rebecca Nurse was executed, her husband and son secretly retrieved her body and buried her there. The claim cannot be treated as casually proven in the way a dated court record can, yet it has endured because it speaks to something emotionally plausible and historically resonant, the refusal of a family to leave one of its own abandoned to disgrace. In that tradition lies an entire hidden drama. Imagine the night. Imagine the knowledge that official punishment did not end with death, but often sought to stain memory as well. Imagine the fear attached to moving a body associated with conviction. Imagine the tenderness and danger of bringing her home. Whether every detail of the tradition can be verified is not the only question. The persistence of the tradition tells us what later generations needed the story to hold, that the condemned woman, denied justice in life, was not denied belonging in death. This is one of the places where Salem's history becomes almost whisper-like. The record speaks loudly about proceedings, dates, accusations, and outcomes. Then suddenly it grows soft around the body itself. Softness is not emptiness. It is a different kind of historical atmosphere. In that softer space, family memory, burial custom, and local reverence begin to carry what the documents do not fully settle. A mystery remains, but not a sensational one. It is a mystery of care. That may be why the Rebecca Nurse homestead affects visitors so differently from many of the more public trial sites. The place does not primarily announce spectacle. It invites a slower form of attention: the wood of the house, the fields around it, the reproduced meeting house, the cemetery stones. The the silence of land that has held memory for centuries. Here, Salem's tragedy is no longer merely civic or judicial. It becomes household tragedy, farm tragedy, generational tragedy. A name familiar from textbooks regains its human scale. Rebecca Nurse's case also matters because it disrupts easy narratives about who was vulnerable. If a respected elderly church member could be swept into accusation, then the crisis was not simply a matter of eliminating obvious outsiders. The circle of danger widened. Reputation, age, and previous standing could fail. In that widening lies one of the reasons fear escalated. Each surprising accusation taught the community a harsher lesson than the one before. No amount of apparent stability guaranteed safety. This is where the trials began to reveal their appetite. Early suspicion may often seek the marginal or the vulnerable, but once a panic is institutionally fed, it rarely remains content with simple targets. It grows bolder. It seeks to explain more. It demands fresh evidence of hidden corruption. Rebecca Nurse's accusation, therefore, lands not only as a personal injustice, but as a sign that the logic of the crisis had expanded beyond anything that a sensible community should have tolerated. Generations later, it is not only the accusation, but the afterlife of Rebecca Nurse that lingers. Her homestead became preserved ground. The property outlived the people who fought over her innocence and guilt. Later caretakers restored, commemorated, interpreted. The poem, the monument, the stories, the maintained land. All of it reflects a long labor of return. Salem often turns public memory into stone, but at the Rebecca Nurse homestead memory also takes the form of enclosure, preservation, and repeated visitation. The place says, quietly, that some moral debts cannot be paid off, only tended. There is another layer as well. The grounds remind us that Salem was not empty before colonial conflict and not simple after it. The site's history reaches back through native use of the land, colonial settlement, family occupancy, revolutionary memory, restoration campaigns, and modern interpretation. In that sense, even Rebecca Nurse's story sits within broader transformations. One life becomes central, yet the land beneath that life has held many other human meanings. Salem's mystery often works this way. Just when you think you have reached the core of one story, another deeper continuity appears underneath. Perhaps the most moving thing about the homestead is the way it reorders moral emphasis. In town, Salem can sometimes feel overexplained. At the homestead, the explanatory voice recedes. The place itself carries much of the burden. The architecture is modest. The atmosphere is quieter than many first-time visitors expect. That quiet matters. It allows Rebecca Nurse to emerge not as an icon of witchcraft culture, but as a person whose world was broken by accusation and whose memory had to be carefully gathered back together. If her body truly was brought home in secret, then the act would have been more than filial devotion. It would have been a small rebellion against the official story. The court might call her condemned. The family could still call her theirs. The state might leave her within the category of the disgraced. The household could refuse that category in the most physical way possible by taking her remains back into family ground. That possibility, hovering between tradition and proof, is one of Salem's most hauntingly humane mysteries. Even if we cannot know every detail with documentary certainty, the burial tradition continues to perform an important kind of truth. It testifies to the need people feel to restore dignity where law once removed it. Historical record and family memory do not always stand in opposition. Sometimes memory preserves the emotional logic of an event that the record was never designed to honor. Rebecca Nurse, therefore, becomes more than a victim among victims. She becomes a key to understanding Salem's emotional terrain. The trials were public, but grief was often private. The accusations were recorded, but care had to find other pathways. The execution was official, but burial may have been hidden. The state produced paperwork. The family produced endurance. When the wind moves across those fields now, nothing on the surface demands certainty. The house stands. The meeting house reproduction waits in stillness. The cemetery gathers names. Visitors lower their voices almost without being told. Somewhere within that calm is the old tension between what can be verified and what can only be faithfully carried forward. Salem is full of louder mysteries, but few are more intimate than this one. How a woman condemned by her own society may have returned, under cover of night and devotion, to the ground that recognized her better than the court ever did. 6. Giles Corey, Silence, and the Weight of Legend. If Rebecca Nurse represents one kind of Salem sorrow, Giles Corey represents another. His story is harsher, more jagged, more entangled with both documented violence and later legend. He was not a spotless, symbolic figure in the way later generations often prefer their martyrs to be. He had lived a long life, had a complex reputation, had earlier brushes with the law, and occupied a social place marked by both standing and controversy. This complexity matters. Salem's victims were not required to be simple in order to be wronged. By the time Giles Corey was accused, the trials had already established their momentum. His wife Martha had been arrested before him. In an especially painful twist, Giles at one point testified against her and later tried to withdraw or revise his position, a movement that only deepened suspicion around him. Here Salem's logic appears in one of its cruelest forms. Even hesitation could be read as guilt. To speak could endanger. To retract could endanger. To be caught within the machinery at all was to find that ordinary moral actions no longer behaved as expected. Giles Corey was an elderly man by then, around 80, and had reason to understand what kind of court he was facing. When he himself was accused and eventually brought to trial, he refused to submit to the court in the usual way. He pleaded not guilty, but also would not put himself upon the country, meaning he would not fully consent to trial by jury in the form required. Historians have argued that his refusal reflected contempt for a process he believed already rigged against him. In previous cases, the pattern had made acquittal almost unimaginable. To proceed might simply be to move with ceremony toward a foregone conclusion. In response, Giles Corey chose silence of a kind, not pure muteness, but a refusal to cooperate with the court's demand. The punishment was pressing, the horrific application of heavy stones to the body of a person who stood mute. In the history of what became the United States, he is remembered as the only person judicially pressed to death. The sheer physicality of that fact has kept his story alive in American imagination. Many histories wound through abstractions. Giles Corey's ends in wait. Even here, Salem resists simplification. The popular story most people know includes the famous last words, "more weight." It is an unforgettable phrase, and perhaps because it is unforgettable, it has settled deeply into cultural memory. But this is precisely the kind of detail Salem teaches us to handle carefully. The tradition is strong, the line powerful, the symbolism perfect. Still, when distinguishing document from legend, one must admit that the phrase belongs to later repetition more securely than to unimpeachable contemporary proof. That does not make it false in every possible sense. It makes it part of Salem's layered afterlife, where historical record and dramatic memory intertwine. In some ways, the legend tells us as much about what later generations wanted Giles Corey to mean as any legal note about his death. They wanted defiance. They wanted a line worthy of a man refusing a corrupt court. They wanted compression, literally and morally, into one unforgettable utterance. More weight answers that need. It transforms prolonged torture into a final gesture of control. Whether or not the words were spoken exactly as tradition insists, the persistence of the legend reveals how Salem's victims have been reshaped into moral emblems over time. Legend, however, should not distract from what is already terrible enough in the record. Giles Corey was pressed to death because he would not submit himself to proceedings he regarded as unjust. He died under a punishment so barbaric that even in Massachusetts' legal context, there were reasons to consider it improper. The violence does not require embellishment. It sits in the archive with its own cold force. There is another enduring theory attached to Giles Corey's silence, that he refused to plead in order to preserve his estate for his heirs rather than allow conviction to trigger forfeiture. That explanation has circulated widely because it grants his silence a practical heroism alongside its moral defiance. Yet scholarship complicates this too. The legal realities of property were more nuanced, and available evidence suggests Corey had already taken steps regarding his estate. Once again, Salem invites caution. The cleaner a story sounds, the more likely history has edges the summary leaves out. Still, practical motives and moral motives need not be absolute opposites. A man under such pressure could have been thinking about reputation, family, contempt for the court, bodily endurance, and worldly consequence all at once. Human decisions, especially under terror, seldom reduce neatly to one cause. Salem's archive often preserves events better than inner certainty. What seems clearest is this. Giles Corey understood the court well enough to recognize that procedure no longer promised fairness. His refusal exposed the system by forcing it into an ugliness difficult to hide. Pressing made visible what the trial process had tried to clothe in legality. It stripped away, For a moment, the tidy surface of institutional order and revealed the brutality beneath. That may help explain why his death has lingered so strongly in public memory. Hanging, though no less tragic, could still be absorbed into the familiar rituals of punishment. Pressing looked older, stranger, almost medieval, even within its own time. It made the trials feel monstrous in a different register. It is one thing to believe a court can condemn the innocent. It is another to picture that court slowly crushing an old man who refuses its terms. Martha Corey, his wife, was executed shortly after him. Their stories form a grim pair. A marriage enters the archive through accusation, contradictory testimony, prison, judicial cruelty, and death. One can only imagine the emotional wreckage inside that sequence, yet much of it remains inaccessible. The record gives structure. The record does not give the private interior. This is another of Salem's absences. History can tell us what the court did to the Coreys far more easily than what they felt while the court was doing it. The later literary afterlife of Giles Corey only deepened his hold on American memory. Dramatists and poets found him irresistible. A man with a rough past, an uncompromising posture, a wife also condemned, a refusal to bend, a body destroyed by law, and a final phrase that sounds carved from granite. This is the kind of figure literature reaches for almost automatically. Arthur Miller would later use Salem as a mirror for his own century's persecutions, and Giles Corey became one of the names through which the trials were moralized anew. Behind all that cultural reuse, the older Salem mystery persists. What does it mean for a place to turn a victim into a legend and still remain unable to undo the original wrong? Giles Corey's name can be admired now. His line can be quoted. His story can be dramatized. None of that alters the fact that a community once accepted the destruction of his body in service of a procedure it mistook for justice. Perhaps that is why silence remains central to his story. Not only the silence of refusing the court, but the silence left in the wake of the event. The silence of fields after pain. The silence of records that noted death without containing the full sound of it. The silence between what likely happened and what later memory wants to hear. Salem is full of voices, but some of its deepest truths remain lodged in silence and stone. If you picture Giles Corey now, do not picture only the legend. Picture also the age in his bones, the exhaustion, the legal room he refused, the landscape around the jail, the society prepared to do this, the neighbors who would later have to live with what their town had permitted. Picture the terrible steadiness of weight itself. A punishment can be dramatic in retelling. In reality, it is often slow, repetitive, almost unimaginably physical. Giles Corey's death presses Salem's history back down into the body, where abstraction fails. There, perhaps, lies his enduring power. He reveals the exact point at which theological fear, social pressure, and legal ritual ceased to be merely ideas and became material force. Salem crushed him under stones. Later memory gave him words. Between those two facts stretches one of the town's most revealing distances, the distance between what happened and what must be said afterward so that the happening can be borne at all. 7. Gallows Hill, Proctor's Ledge, and the landscape that corrected memory. For a long time, many people thought they knew where the executions happened. Gallows Hill had the right name, the right dramatic rise, the right ability to satisfy imagination. A place of death, surely, should look the part. History is often tempted by topography that confirms its expectations. Steepness feels more theatrical than a ledge near a residential area. Height feels more symbolic. A hill can hold a public story for generations simply because it appears to deserve it. Salem, as so often happens, turned out to be quieter and stranger than the dramatic version allowed. In 2016, researchers confirmed that Proctor's Ledge, at the base of Gallows Hill, was the site of the 1692 executions. The finding did not create tragedy where there had been none. The tragedy was always there. What changed was the map. Public memory had to step slightly aside and let the landscape speak with more precision. This correction matters for more than antiquarian reasons. It reveals one of Salem's central patterns. The town's past is not only preserved, it is revised through patient return to evidence. The famous location was not wholly invented, but the specific spot had drifted. A lower, less theatrical place proved truer than the elevated image that had dominated public imagination. In that movement from hilltop drama to ledge-level accuracy lies a whole philosophy of historical humility. Proctor's Ledge today does not announce itself like a spectacle. That too, feels fitting. It sits in a residential neighborhood, a quiet place where everyday life now passes near a site of irreversible loss. The memorial, dedicated in 2017, bears the names of the 19 victims executed there. A circular granite wall, individual plaques, a locust tree, and the words "We remember" make the space feel less like a stage than a correction of silence. The effect is sober, almost disarmingly plain. Perhaps plainness is exactly what the site needed. The old public imagination wanted Gallows Hill as an emblem, something large enough to hold all the moral drama people had projected onto Salem. Proctor's Ledge resists that impulse. It insists instead on locality. Here. Not vaguely there, but here. Near houses. Near roads. Near the ordinary world that continued after the killings and eventually covered them with other routines. There is something profoundly unsettling in that nearness. History did not happen in an abstract zone set apart from life. It happened where life went on. One of Salem's recurring reversals. The town people think they know is often composed of famous surfaces, but the truer town waits just beside them, slightly lower, less mythic, more exact. A researcher returns to old evidence. A physical landscape is reread. A story everyone has inherited shifts underfoot. The resulting change may seem modest to outsiders. Yet for Salem, it alters the moral choreography of memory. Where people stand matters. Where people mourn matters. Where the dead are named matters. To stand at Proctor's Ledge is to feel how little the landscape resembles the lurid mental pictures attached to Salem by popular culture. There is no grand theatrical void demanding performance. There is only a measured memorial in a place that asks for lowered voices. In that quiet, the trials become less gothic and more human. 19 people were hanged there. The fact lands differently when the surroundings do not try to romanticize it. Another forgotten mystery is this: how often truth becomes clearer when the scenery becomes less dramatic. We like our historical tragedies to occupy settings that resemble our emotions about them. Salem repeatedly denies that convenience. Its real places are often more intimate, more domestic, more entangled with ordinary geography than public fantasy would prefer. Execution took place not on a cinematic summit, but on a ledge at the base of one. The difference is not trivial. It teaches us how memory can be drawn upward toward symbolism while evidence remains lower, heavier, harder to stylize. There is also something deeply American in the timing of the correction. More than 3 centuries after the executions, the town was still refining the coordinates of its most famous suffering. History had not ended with monument or textbook. It remained active, provisional in places, open to rereading. Salem continues to behave like that. The town does not simply preserve a fixed past. It invites repeated negotiations between archive, landscape, and public feeling. Even when evidence becomes stronger, mystery is not abolished. Proctor's Ledge can be confirmed as the execution site. That does not tell us everything the ground has carried since. It does not dissolve the layers of forgetting and misplacement that came before. It does not erase the years in which people mourned elsewhere, imagined elsewhere, pointed visitors elsewhere. A corrected location still contains the history of previous error. That is why the site feels almost doubled. It holds the original violence of 1692, but it also holds the later history of remembrance. What was known, what was guessed, what was wrongly emphasized, what scholars restored, what the memorial now tries to stabilize. Salem's places are seldom only themselves. They also contain the memory of how they were misunderstood. Imagine the ledge before the memorial. Imagine it as a fact without a proper public form. The executions happened, the dead entered history, and yet the exact place drifted in collective narration. Then imagine the research, the careful reading, the town slowly agreeing to a more precise grief. There is something moving in that sequence. Not redemptive, exactly. Nothing can redeem the original act, but moving nonetheless. The landscape was asked again, and this time the answer was heard more clearly. The words, "We remember," are simple enough to risk seeming obvious. But at Proctor's Ledge, their simplicity acquires weight. Remembering here does not mean indulging in a dramatic aesthetic of haunting. It means naming the dead where they died. It means letting the specific correct the symbolic. It means choosing accuracy as an ethical act. In that sense, Proctor's Ledge is not only a memorial to the victims, it is a memorial to the discipline of looking again. Salem needed that discipline in 1692 and failed to practice it. The modern town, in returning to the site with evidence and care, performs a late version of the attention that earlier authorities lacked. Instead of asking fear where guilt might lie, scholars asked archives and terrain where truth might rest. That does not make the story neat. It makes it more Salem-like. The place remains haunted, not because bodies walk there in moonlight, but because meaning itself had to be recovered from beneath old assumptions. A town famous for accusation learned, centuries later, how to accuse its own memory of inaccuracy and do better. So the legend endures, quiet, corrected, still carrying both the dead and the long delay in naming their true place. If you wanted a single Salem image for the difference between myth and record, between dramatic expectation and difficult truth, you could do worse than this. The hill drew the eye. The ledge held the fact. 8. The harbor that made another Salem. To speak only of witchcraft in Salem is to forget that the town also faced the sea. Long after the Panic of 1692, and in some ways both before and after it in spirit, Salem belonged to another rhythm entirely, the rhythm of tide, cargo, ledger, mast, and rumor carried over water. This maritime Salem does not cancel the darker Salem of trials and memorials. It complicates it. It reminds us that the town known for persecution was also a place of outward motion, commercial ambition, and astonishing global reach. Today, Salem Maritime National Historical Park preserves portions of that waterfront world. Established in 1938 as the first National Historic Site in the United States, the park interprets centuries of New England maritime history. The fact of its establishment matters symbolically. Salem entered the national preservation imagination not only because of the witch trials, but because of its harbor and the stories that moved through it. America chose, in effect, to remember Salem through ships as well as through fear. The waterfront encourages a different way of breathing the town. Stand there, and the psychological pressure of the village begins to loosen. The horizon opens. Trade routes replace farm boundaries. Salt air replaces enclosed hearing rooms. Instead of a society monitoring itself with theological suspicion, one senses a port city measuring distance, profit, danger, and opportunity. This is not a morally innocent world. Trade carries its own violences, dependencies, and hierarchies. But it is a world oriented outward rather than inward. That outwardness shaped Salem profoundly. Harbors make communities think in terms of elsewhere. Cargo arrives with stories. Merchants calculate across oceans. Sailors disappear for months or years, then return with goods, debts, scars, and altered expectations. A port city is never as psychologically sealed as a village that watches its own members more closely than it watches the horizon. The sea interrupts parochial certainty even while generating new kinds of ambition. This is one reason the harbor feels like a counterspell to the Salem of accusation. The village taught people to read one another suspiciously at close range. The waterfront demanded broader forms of navigation. Ships had to be built, crews assembled, accounts managed, partners trusted across distance, foreign markets understood. The sea can widen a town's imagination even as it exposes the town to the dangers of empire and commerce. Salem learned both lessons. By the 18th and early 19th centuries, maritime enterprise would help define the place. Counting houses stood near the wharves where captains and merchants balanced accounts, bought and sold cargoes, exchanged money, and transformed physical movement into commercial value. These small buildings, easy to overlook beside larger historic houses, reveal another face of Salem's mystery. A town haunted in the public imagination by spectral evidence was, in another register, obsessed with measurement, bookkeeping, and real-world exchange. How strange that one place should carry both impulses so strongly. On one side, a history of invisible threat and judicial imagination. On the other, a history of worldly calculation and global traffic. The same town could produce both. Perhaps that should not surprise us. Human communities are rarely one thing at a time. Still, in Salem, the contrast feels especially sharp. Beneath the famous darkness lies a disciplined commercial intelligence that tied the town to Arabia, to Asia, to distant markets most Americans today would not immediately associate with Salem at all. This is where the story of shipbuilding enters. The history preserved around places like the House of the Seven Gables includes the achievements of maritime families and builders whose vessels moved beyond the expected circuits of colonial life. Salem ships visited distant regions, sometimes becoming among the first American vessels to do so in particular routes. The port's ambition was not local. It reached outward with confidence. Imagine what that meant for the town's identity. A place once scarred by inward suspicion grew, in later eras, through outward risk. Men who might never have trusted one another in a meeting-house quarrel could still invest in cargo bound for a foreign market. The social energy shifted. Paper no longer only confined. It counted, insured, transacted, corresponded. The language of danger changed from witchcraft to weather, piracy, loss at sea, and commercial failure. The harbor did not simply replace the older Salem. It settled atop it. This is the pattern we keep finding, one Salem layering over another. The witch trial memory remained. The seafaring fortunes rose. Buildings changed hands. Streets altered their significance. Later generations would visit the waterfront, perhaps knowing more about the trials than about the trade that had once sent local ships across the globe. But the harbor persisted, carrying the quieter proof that Salem had been broader than its most famous wound. There is a sensory difference between the two Salems as well. The trial landscape is often imagined through winter soil, narrow rooms, candlelight, and the pressure of public examination. The maritime landscape speaks in creaking ropes, wet stone, open sky, gull sound, salt wind, timber, and the deep patience of tide against dock. One constricts, the other opens. To move between them in modern Salem is to move between emotional climates as distinct as two different stories. Both, however, are stories about uncertainty. The village feared invisible corruption. The harbor faced visible hazard. Ships vanish. Markets fail. Storms break certainty with no concern for doctrine. Perhaps port life taught another lesson the village world had resisted, that not everything can be moralized into fault. Some losses are worldly. Some dangers come from distance rather than deviance. The sea humbles interpretive arrogance because it cannot be easily argued with. It is also possible that maritime Salem encouraged later forms of memory that differed from the trial legacy. Commerce leaves objects, houses, ledgers, customs, imported goods, architectural styles, and family narratives of adventure. It gives descendants something to preserve proudly. The trials gave descendants something harder to metabolize. A town with both inheritances would naturally struggle over which face to present to the world. Modern tourism, of course, often collapses that struggle into convenience. The spooky Salem sells easily. The mercantile Salem requires more patience. But patience is precisely what reveals the town more fully. The harbor explains that Salem was never just a site of superstition. It was an American gateway, a node in vast exchange, a place where local streets connected unexpectedly to global movement. Such a town cannot be understood if one only listens to the courtroom. Another mystery tucked inside the waterfront story. The same society capable of unimaginable inward cruelty could also produce outward daring, technical skill, and commercial sophistication. Americans often prefer moral categories cleaner than that. Salem refuses them. A place can be judicially disastrous and economically ingenious. It can mistake afflicted girls for evidence of diabolic assault and also manage long-distance maritime enterprise with impressive competence. Contradiction is not a flaw in the historical portrait. It is the portrait. When evening settles over the harbor and the light turns flat on the water, you are looking at more than scenery. You are looking at another Salem, one almost buried beneath the fame of the first. A Salem of outward routes, warehouse logic, ship carpentry, maritime wealth, and the restless knowledge that the world is wider than village fear. This wider Salem does not absolve the narrower one, but it does remind us that the town's identity has always been larger, stranger, and less reducible than the name alone suggests. 9. The House of the Seven Gables and the architecture of inherited unease. Few buildings in Salem gather as many layers of feeling as the House of the Seven Gables. Built in 1668 for Captain John Turner, the house stands as a maritime monument before it becomes anything else, a sign of wealth, trade, and the success of a family deeply woven into the mercantile economy of Puritan New England. Yet later, generations do not approach it only as a merchant's house. The building has been pulled into literary imagination, preservation culture, and Salem's broader aura of haunted moral inheritance. It is one of those places where architecture begins to behave like memory. A house built for commerce can acquire a second life as atmosphere. The Gables did exactly that. Its timber, angles, waterfront setting, and long survival made it ideal material for reinterpretation. By the time Nathaniel Hawthorne transformed the building in the cultural imagination through his novel, the house had already become more than the sum of its practical origins. It offered a physical shell into which later centuries could pour guilt, secrecy, family burden, and the old New England sense that the past remains structurally present. Before the symbolism, there was the harbor, The house belonged to a Salem shaped by ships and exchange. Captain John Turner, I was not simply inhabiting quaint history. He was participating in a world of economic ambition that defined much of the region's reality. The house therefore embodies something easy to miss when Salem is reduced to witch trial mythology. Substantial wealth could be made there, and made through worldly skill rather than supernatural fear. Still, wealth and unease have never been strangers. Old port cities often produce houses that seem to absorb the ethical residue of their success. Timber records fortune, but it also records weather, labor, distance, and the social worlds that sustained profit. In Salem, where commercial energy and moral anxiety coexisted so uneasily, a surviving mansion can feel almost overcharged with implication. The House of the Seven Gables is not a courtroom relic, but it belongs to the same broader world of Puritan inheritance, social hierarchy, and intergenerational memory. Around it, the campus deepens the effect. Historic structures linked to shipbuilding and commerce, including the old counting house and buildings associated with families like the Becketts, preserve the practical infrastructure of maritime Salem. Counting houses were where trade became numbers, where cargoes became account lines, where movement over water ended in written reckoning. Again, the contrast with 1692 grows sharp. Salem's paper world could condemn the innocent. It could also measure ships and goods with disciplined precision. The same culture that failed morally could succeed commercially. Within this structure, the House of the Seven Gables holds that contradiction in wood. It is beautiful and heavy at once. Its survival invites admiration, but also inquiry. What kind of society built this? What was visible from its windows in the late 17th century? What rumors moved along the waterfront while families dined inside? How much of Salem's later atmosphere comes from the trials, and how much from the slower pressure of old architecture carrying centuries of unresolved association? Nathaniel Hawthorne is essential here, not because he invented Salem's darkness, but because he inherited and refined it. Born in Salem and later connected to the Gables through his literary imagination and his work in the Custom House, Hawthorne became one of the town's most sensitive interpreters of moral afterlife. He understood something the modern tourist industry often flattens. Salem's unease is not merely spooky. It is ethical. It arises from the persistence of buried wrongdoing in the structure of family, community, and memory. In Hawthorne's work, houses often seem to remember. They hold shame in their stairways, pride in their facades, silence in their chambers. The Gables, whether or not it precisely matches every fictional shadow later cast across it, became an ideal vessel for that insight. A building can outlive the motives that built it and become a repository for consequences no one intended. Salem, with its preserved structures and unresolved pasts, offered Hawthorne a whole civic language of inherited burden. This is one reason it would be a mistake to treat Hawthorne as a cheap Gothic accessory to Salem's history. He matters because he recognized the town's deeper storytelling engine. Salem is full of places where the visible object, house, wharf, ledger, memorial, contains more than its immediate use. Hawthorne knew how to hear the moral echo inside material form. He made architecture psychological without stripping it of historical weight. Stand there long enough, and the House of the Seven Gables rewards that kind of listening. Stand there long enough, and the building seems to shift registers. First, it is a prosperous merchant house. Then it is a survivor from a vanished waterfront world. Then it is a literary icon. Then it is a symbol of how families curate and conceal their own pasts. Then it is simply old wood by the water again, quiet, wine-touched, nearly patient in its refusal to become only one meaning. That refusal is very Salem. There is also a preservation mystery here. Why do some structures become central to public memory while others fade? The trials left fields, ledges, graves, paper records. Maritime Salem left houses, counting rooms, and visible artifacts of prosperity. The built environment often privileges what can be saved materially. A merchant house can be restored and toured. A vanished hearing room can only be reconstructed. The result is a skew in memory. Architecture stabilizes some stories more readily than others. Seen from that angle, the Gables therefore participates in Salem's afterlife, not only as content, but as evidence of what survives best. Timber lasts where voice does not. Foundation stones outlive panic. A house can gather visitors for centuries because its physical continuity offers reassurance even when its meanings remain unsettled. In a town where so much history concerns invisible forces and contested memory, the endurance of a building can feel almost like an answer. Yet the answer is partial. Buildings endure, but the moral worlds that pass through them remain interpretively open. Perhaps that is why the gables continue to fascinate. They seem solid, but solidity itself becomes mysterious in Salem. What appears fixed contains layers of reinvention. The house built for one mercantile family becomes a literary inheritance for a nation. The practical becomes atmospheric. The domestic becomes emblematic. A structure rooted in trade begins to participate in the town's larger drama of hidden histories. Still, the harbor lies nearby, reminding us that all this atmosphere began in a real coastal economy. The old house does not float free of material history. Ships, money, craftsmanship, and ambition made it possible. Hawthorne later gave that material history a moral weather system. Preservation then gave it institutional continuity. Tourism finally gave it audience. 4 different Salems pass through the same building. If you wanted to understand the town in a single glance, the House of the Seven Gables would come close. It contains maritime power, Puritan inheritance, literary reinterpretation, and the preserved hush of old wood that always seems to know more than it says. It is not a witch trial site, and yet it belongs to the same deep pattern. A place where what survives physically keeps attracting meanings that reach far beneath the surface. In the evening, when the harbor darkens and the house settles into silhouette, you can almost sense the different centuries arranging themselves inside it. Trade first, family next, literature later, tourism after that. Underneath all of them, the old New England habit of storing consequence in architecture. Salem did not build only stories. It built containers for stories, and some of those containers are still standing, waiting for anyone patient enough to notice how many inheritances they hold at once. 10. Frontier echoes, bad weather, and the season of general misery. There is a temptation, when telling Salem's story, to keep everything tightly inside Essex County, as though the town generated its terror from local material alone. But fear in 1692 did not respect such boundaries. It traveled along roads, through letters, by rumor, by displaced people, by shared news of violence happening elsewhere. To understand the emotional weather of Salem, you have to widen the frame beyond the village and the town and listen to the frontier echoing in the background. The New England colonies were living in the shadow of war. Conflict involving the English, the French, and indigenous allies in the main frontier made northern settlements feel exposed. Raids, uncertainty, displacement, and stories of attack shaped the atmosphere far beyond the immediate zones of combat. Even for those not directly touched by violence, the knowledge that vulnerable settlements could be shattered by forces arriving from the margins created a deep and lingering instability. Salem did not need to be physically invaded in order to absorb the psychology of threat. Frontier fear teaches a specific lesson. Danger may already be moving toward you while still remaining unseen. It trains imagination to stay alert to hints, signs, omissions, and rumors. It encourages communities to read uncertainty as warning. If strangers arrive carrying terrible news, or if relatives of those lost on the frontier appear with grief and stories of destruction, then the local world becomes more porous to catastrophe. The boundary between there and here weakens. In such a condition, invisible enemies begin to feel plausible, not merely because theology allows for them, but because politics and war have already normalized the idea that hidden forces can break into ordinary life. Salem's residents lived in a colonial system where imperial rivalries, armed conflict, and contested frontiers were real. Their fears were not fabricated from nothing. The tragedy lay in how those fears could be displaced inward, onto neighbors, servants, elderly women, ministers' social rivals, and anyone whose existence became legible as threat. Then add the bodily knowledge of hardship. Historical sources emphasize that the years surrounding the trials were marked by severe strain, including smallpox and punishing weather. Coldest winters. Dreariest summers. Fields that did not answer labor with generosity. Illness moving through households. The ordinary routines that are supposed to persuade people the world remains governable began to fail. A society may preach providence in all seasons, but providence is harder to interpret when misery arrives from every direction at once. Weather alone does not create witch trials. Disease alone does not create witch trials. War alone does not create witch trials. But a culture already primed to interpret suffering morally can become more brittle under cumulative stress. If the air feels wrong, the crops feel wrong, the news feels wrong, the body feels wrong, and authority feels wrong, then explanations that promise hidden coherence become dangerously attractive. Someone must be at fault. Something must have opened the way for collective affliction. A people used to covenantal thinking may decide that pressure itself is evidence of corruption. What is striking about Salem is how ordinary miseries and extraordinary interpretations became mutually reinforcing. A child falls ill. A winter drags on. A frontier report arrives. A sermon warns of diabolic intrusion. A village feud remains unresolved. A magistrate hears testimony in a framework that treats invisible assault as actionable. One burden alone might be endured. Together, they alter the mental texture of everyday life. The world starts to feel saturated with meaning, and not the gentle kind. That saturation is important. Salem's panic did not emerge from a blank emotional landscape suddenly electrified by one accusation. It emerged from a season in which too many parts of life already felt unstable. By the time the judicial crisis took shape, people had been living inside a generalized condition of apprehension. The trials then gave that apprehension names and procedures. There is another unsettling angle here. Communities under stress often become hungry for moral simplification because simplification feels like relief. Complexity exhausts. To say that weather, illness, political instability, warfare, local faction, and theology all interacted is historically responsible, but not emotionally satisfying to people in the middle of the storm. They want one enemy, one source, one explanatory key. Salem found one in witchcraft, and once it did, the ordinary miseries of life could be interpreted not as random hardship, but as signs within a larger plot. This is why certain later myths about the trials remain less convincing than they first appear. A theory that points only to tainted rye or only to medical symptoms may explain a fragment of behavior, but it misses the total climate. Salem was not looking for a chemical cause. Salem was living inside a narrative hunger generated by broad instability. A single physiological trigger could never have produced the scale of communal participation, legal enforcement, and spiritual certainty that followed. The soil was already troubled long before anyone tried to identify one contaminant. And perhaps this broader weather explains the town's lingering atmosphere too. Salem still feels layered with different forms of pressure. Not because the frontier is near or the same winter still holds the fields, but because the story that survives is one in which many anxieties met at once. We inherit not merely the facts of the trials, but the sense of compression that preceded them. The place seems to remember what it feels like when too many systems fail at the same time. Imagine a family in Salem Village hearing distant political troubles they cannot control, local disputes they cannot resolve, weather they cannot improve, disease they cannot cure, and sermons that tell them all events may reveal judgment. Imagine how narrow the margin for calm would become. In such a world, the appetite for certainty might start to feel nearly bodily. Accusation offers certainty at a terrible price. Here is one of the most humanly tragic parts of Salem. The same people who wanted order may have helped destroy it because they wanted it so badly. The same households seeking reassurance may have supported procedures that widened suffering instead. Fear does not always present itself as a wish for chaos. Often it arrives wearing the face of restoration. We must do something. We must identify the source. We must defend the community. Salem's catastrophe unfolded beneath exactly that kind of moral urgency. When you widen the frame enough to include frontier war and weather misery, the trials stop looking like an isolated local absurdity. They begin to resemble a community under total stress, searching for explanations while its interpretive tools drove it toward violence. That does not excuse anything, but it reveals the depth of the pressure chamber. And perhaps this is why the town remains so resonant. Salem is not only a story about false belief, it is also a story about what people do when life feels besieged from too many directions at once. The names of the accused still matter. The judicial failure still matters. But behind them all stand wind, illness, rumor, and imperial conflict. The less visible forces that taught the town to hear threat in every creak of uncertainty. 11. Archives, missing pieces, and the town built from fragments. For all the documentation Salem left behind, the town remains full of absences. This may be the most important thing to understand once the famous names begin to feel familiar. The archive is rich, but it is not whole. It contains legal records, depositions, complaints, timelines, and later interpretations. It can show us procedure and sequence. It can restore many voices, at least in part. But there are still silences everywhere. What was felt but not written, what was said in passing and never recorded, what families carried forward privately, what bodies endured without leaving language equal to the pain, what locations drifted out of memory and had to be recovered later. Salem therefore exists not only as a documented tragedy, but as a town continually assembled from fragments. Scholars return to manuscripts, museums preserve objects, historical societies gather scraps of local continuity, family traditions retain stories the formal record cannot entirely confirm or entirely dismiss. A later generation restores a house. Another generation reevaluates a monument. Another finds significance in a burial site or a stretch of waterfront once treated as secondary. Every act of historical reconstruction in Salem feels a little like searching a room where much has survived and much has also been carried off by time. Fragmentation of this kind is not unique to Salem, of course. All history is partial, but Salem's fame makes the partiality more visible. The town is so heavily narrated that one might assume it is fully known. In truth, what people often know is the most compressed public version. They know the outline. They do not always know how much of the lived reality still sits dispersed across institutions, local traditions, contested interpretations, and physical sites whose meanings had to be pieced together patiently. The archive at places like the Salem Witch Trials documentary archive is invaluable precisely because it resists romantic vagueness. It returns us to documents, to names, to the language of the time, to the uneasy precision of legal process. But even such resources do not close every gap. Documents can illuminate accusation without restoring trust. They can preserve testimony without revealing motive. They can tell us that a complaint was filed, a person jailed, a hearing held, a sentence carried out. They cannot always tell us what silence filled the road home afterward. And then there are the objects and structures that survive outside the paper world. A preserved house, a cemetery, a memorial wall, a counting house by the harbor. These too are fragments, though fragments of a different kind. They give physical continuity where text cannot. Yet material survival has its own distortions. Some things endure because they were built to endure, or because later generations valued them enough to preserve them. Other realities, emotions, sounds, gestures, weather, fear moving through a room, leave little stable trace. Salem's surviving wood and stone can comfort us into thinking the past is more intact than it is. There is a moral humility in recognizing this. The goal is not to throw up our hands and say nothing can be known. Much can be known. The goal is to hold knowledge and incompleteness together. Salem teaches that discipline again and again. We know the trials killed 25 innocent women, men, and children between 1692 and 1693, most by hanging, one by pressing, some by dying in prison. We know tensions between Salem Town and Salem Village mattered. We know political instability, frontier anxiety, religious conflict, disease, and severe weather formed the wider setting. We know Proctor's Ledge was confirmed as the execution site in 2016. We know the Rebecca Nurse homestead preserves the only publicly open home of an executed victim. We know Salem's harbor linked the town to global trade. These are not guesses. But alongside what we know, large, softer zones remain. Did every famous last word occur exactly as later memory insists? Were bodies moved in precisely the ways tradition says? How did ordinary people privately interpret events they publicly seem to accept? How long did it take for shame, grief, and disbelief to settle into later generations? What did it feel like to live in Salem once the panic had passed, but the memory had not? The fragments cannot answer all of this directly. That partiality contributes to Salem's peculiar force. In some historical places, missing information fades into the background. In Salem, it becomes part of the atmosphere. The town seems built not only from preserved fact, but from the spaces between preserved facts. A missing certainty, a disputed location, an inherited phrase whose documentation remains thin. A body remembered through family devotion more than state acknowledgement. A landscape whose meaning changed as scholars asked better questions. If you listen closely, Salem is a place of after questions. Not only what happened, but what was overlooked. Not only who died, but where exactly. Not only what did the court say, but what did the family do afterward. Not only which building survives, but why does that building survive while another exists only in reconstruction? The town invites this mode of thought because its archive is robust enough to encourage inquiry and incomplete enough to keep inquiry alive. There is also a civic dimension to the fragmentary nature of memory. Communities decide, consciously or not, what pieces of themselves to foreground. Salem has lived many lives since 1692. Maritime wealth, literary prestige, architectural preservation, tourism, and local activism have all shaped how the town presents itself. The archive, therefore, does not exist outside public life. it is interpreted within it. What gets emphasized in one century may be backgrounded in another. A town built from fragments is also a town built from editorial choices. This is why historical work in Salem matters so much. To read the documents carefully, to preserve houses responsibly, to mark sites accurately, to distinguish tradition from proof without mocking tradition, to correct old errors without pretending final perfection. These are not just scholarly tasks, they are ethical ones. A place once deformed by bad interpretation now depends on good interpretation for its moral afterlife. Perhaps that is one of Salem's most beautiful reversals. The town where evidence was once mishandled became a town where evidence must be handled with exceptional care. The archive that preserves injustice also trains later generations toward better forms of attention. The documents cannot restore the dead, but they can ask the living to proceed more honestly. When dusk comes over, Salem and the streets begin to empty. The town can feel almost assembled from separated pieces held in gentle tension. Harbor and hill, homestead and memorial, manuscript and legend, house museum and prison memory, cemetery and counting house. Each fragment glows faintly in its own register. Together, they form a place more complex than any single guided narrative can contain. This is why Salem never fully closes. A fragmentary town cannot be finished. It can only be revisited, reread, rewalked. It offers not the satisfaction of complete understanding, but the deeper quiet of persistent attention. And in that quiet, the missing pieces themselves become part of what one comes to honor. 12. The Salem that sells, the Salem that waits beneath it. Modern Salem lives with a difficult inheritance. It is both a historical place and a public brand. The witch trials made the town famous in a way few American communities ever become famous. Later literature deepened the aura. Architecture preserved the visual texture. Tourism transformed all of that into experience. Walk through Salem in season, and you can feel the layers colliding. Scholarship beside souvenir shops, memorials beside performances, solemn history beside playful spectacle, grief translated into signage and costume. It is an uneasy arrangement, though perhaps not an avoidable one. There is no simple moral position from which to judge this. Towns survive by living, not by becoming frozen reliquaries. Visitors support institutions that preserve knowledge. Popular fascination, even when imperfect, can lead people toward real history. And yet Salem's commercial afterlife undeniably risks flattening the very complexity that makes the place worth serious attention. The loudest version of Salem sells the easiest: witches, hauntings, darkness, October delight. The quieter Salem, the one built from legal nuance, family sorrow, maritime commerce, archival fragments, and careful distinctions between record and legend, waits underneath, harder to market and easier to miss. This tension between the Salem that sells and the Salem that waits beneath it is itself one of the town's forgotten mysteries. How does a place honor the dead while making a living from the story of their deaths? How does a community transform inherited tragedy into public identity without becoming trapped inside simplification? How does the educational impulse coexist with the performative one? Salem has been living with those questions for generations. In some ways, the town's built environment helps both sides at once. Old houses, wharves, memorials, and museums provide real anchors for history. They also provide visual fuel for atmosphere. A 17th century structure can teach. It can also be consumed as mood. A memorial can invite reflection. It can also be passed quickly by people in search of a more dramatic stop. The physical town cannot control the attention brought to it. Yet perhaps Salem's greatest defense against flattening is that the deeper history remains more compelling the longer one stays. Spectacle burns bright and fast. The archive works slowly. The brand offers immediate recognition. The landscape, when patiently walked, offers revision. A person may arrive expecting a neatly packaged story and leave with something far more unsettled. The realization that Salem is not a theme, but a layered civic memory still negotiating with itself. This is where educational institutions, local historians, archives, and carefully curated historic sites matter so much. They keep the underlying Salem legible. They remind visitors that the town famous for witches is also a town of trade, legal history, indigenous precedents on the land, literary inheritance, and community self-correction. They push gently but firmly against the pressure to make everything spooky and simple. Still, the simple version persists because simple versions always persist. They are easier to sell, easier to share, easier to recognize at a glance. But Salem's real viral power, the thing that makes people keep returning in books, films, essays, lectures, and memory, is not the costume shop version. It is the discovery that the familiar Salem is only the first layer. What most people miss is what the town becomes when you stop asking where the witches were and start asking what the place had to be before and after such accusations could define it. Once you ask that, the town opens. You begin to see the harbor not as scenic background, but as the making of another civic identity. You begin to see the village-town divide as social architecture rather than footnote. You begin to notice how memorials correct old assumptions, how houses preserve moral atmosphere, how family traditions protect the dead from official categories, how literature transforms civic memory into national inheritance. The Salem that waits beneath the public Salem is not smaller, it is much larger. There is also a kind of melancholy in this modern layering. The victims of 1692 could not have imagined becoming fixtures in an industry of remembrance and fascination. Nor could the merchants who built harbor fortunes have imagined that their port would one day be overshadowed internationally by a brief period of judicial catastrophe. Salem became famous for one of its worst moments, while many of its other histories had to struggle for equal attention. That imbalance feels almost like a second haunting, not supernatural, but historiographical. Still, the town has not surrendered entirely to that imbalance. The correction of Proctor's Ledge, the preservation of the Rebecca Nurse homestead, the continued work of maritime interpretation, the enduring presence of places like the House of the Seven Gables, the scholarly return to trial records. All these represent forms of resistance to simplification. Salem is constantly trying to reintroduce itself beyond its own stereotype. The visitor who slows down can feel that effort. Beneath the signs and expectations, there is another cadence. It lives in the quieter streets, in the harbor wind, in museum labels, in preserved timber, in cemetery grass, in the hush that often falls around memorial spaces despite the town's commercial energy. That deeper cadence says, stay longer, ask better questions, do not confuse atmosphere with understanding. Perhaps every famous historical place contains this split between performance and depth. Salem simply displays it more openly because its brand is so powerful and its underlying history so much more various than the brand suggests. The town, therefore, becomes a lesson in historical consumption itself. Are you here for a known image, or are you willing to let the image be dismantled? Are you seeking confirmation of the Salem you expected, or contact with the Salem that keeps unsettling expectation? It is not necessary to despise the popular town in order to love the deeper one. The two are now interwoven. But it is necessary to notice the difference. One glitters, the other waits. One trades in immediate recognition. The other rewards patient disillusionment. One is what the town must partly perform to meet the world. The other is what the town still is when the performance quiets down. By evening, after the crowds thin and the harbor light flattens, the second Salem becomes easier to hear. The theatrical edges soften. The streets return to themselves. Old wood and salt air begin to outweigh costume and slogan. In that quieter register, the town resumes its older habit of withholding final simplicity. It is not just the witch city. It is a place where America's appetite for myth, commerce, guilt, reinvention, and selective memory can all be studied in one walk. That is the Salem worth staying with. Not because it is more comfortable, but because it is more true. The Salem that sells may bring people to the door. The Salem beneath it is what remains after the door closes and the town, at last, begins to speak in its own lower voice. 13. Beneath the colonial story, older ground. One of the most subtle distortions in Salem's public memory is the way the town can appear to begin with the story most often told about it. First the village, then the trials, then the harbor fortunes, then Hawthorne, then tourism. It is a neat sequence, and like many neat sequences, it hides what came before. The land on which Salem's better-known histories unfolded was not empty waiting ground. It already held human use, movement, knowledge, and meaning long before English settlement sorted it into farms, wharves, and meeting house disputes. Even small acknowledgments of this fact changed the emotional scale of the town. At the Rebecca Nurse homestead, for example, the property's longer history points back to native use of the ground before colonial occupation. Such notes can seem brief in the face of later famous events. But briefness should not be mistaken for insignificance. It reminds us that Salem's colonial narratives, however old they feel to modern Americans, were themselves later arrivals layered over older presences. This matters because Salem is, among other things, a town about erasure. The judicial crisis of 1692 erased innocence through accusation. Later, tourism can erase complexity through branding. But colonial settlement also worked by erasing prior claims, prior movements, and prior systems of meaning tied to land. To say this is not to dissolve Salem's specific story into abstraction. It is to place that story inside a broader American pattern in which one historical layer often advances by covering another. Once you begin to think about Salem in layers of occupation and memory, the town shifts again. The fields associated with the village are no longer only Puritan fields. The harbor is no longer only an engine of colonial and early American commerce. The house sites, roads, burial grounds, and restored structures all begin to sit atop deeper histories of displacement and renaming. The familiar Salem of 17th century conflict becomes one chapter in a longer land story. That longer story does not always leave equally visible traces. Colonial records are often far more abundant than the evidence of the people displaced by colonial expansion. This imbalance is itself part of the historical condition. One system wrote itself down with relentless confidence. Other ways of inhabiting the land were more easily pushed to the margins of the surviving archive. Salem, like much of New England, therefore carries a silence beneath its better preserved documents. To notice that silence is not to solve it. It is simply to refuse the illusion that the town begins where the English record becomes convenient. The meeting house, the farm, the prison, the wharf, the counting house, the memorial, all stand on ground older than the stories most visitors are taught first. That older ground does not vanish because later histories became more famous. It remains, often unspoken, beneath them. There is a strange moral parallel here. Salem's more famous mysteries often concern the difference between what the public story says and what the deeper record suggests. Gallows Hill and Proctor's Ledge, legend and documentation, spectacle and sight. The same habit of correction can be extended further back. Before the colonial story, there was another human story, less fully preserved in the town's popular self-presentation, but no less real. What lies beneath Salem is not only the forgotten village beneath the tourist city, but older worlds beneath the colonial one. Perhaps this helps explain why the town feels so layered, even when one cannot immediately say why. The place has been named and renamed through different regimes of meaning. People have asked different things of the same harbor water, the same winter ground, the same timber, the same pathways. A sacred geography can become a commercial one. A family farm can become a historic site. A place of execution can become a residential edge marked by memorial stone. Salem keeps changing what its land is for, without ever fully emptying the land of what it was before. That is part of what makes the town's atmosphere more than Gothic residue. It is the feeling of accumulated claims. Some recorded, some suppressed, some monumentalized, some sold, some quietly tended, some barely acknowledged at all. The famous history is not false. It is simply incomplete when it pretends to be first. Incompleteness, in Salem, always leads us back to humility. A patient telling of the town should be willing to pause where the record grows thinner, willing to admit that later colonial drama unfolded on older inhabited ground, willing to hold the known and the undernamed side by side. In a place so often simplified into one marketable image, even that pause becomes a form of respect. So when we move through Salem's best-known episodes, it helps to imagine the land itself as a longer witness than any archive. The paper begins at one point. The earth begins earlier. The public story starts where the town became legible to colonial power. The deeper story does not start there at all. This older ground does not speak in slogans. It is easier to feel than to summarize. A field preserved as heritage still remembers previous footsteps beyond the commemorative frame. A shoreline admired for maritime history once served different patterns of attention entirely. Salem is layered not only by centuries, but by unequal visibility. Some pasts stand behind glass. Others remain almost subterranean. Perhaps that is one final reason the town should be approached slowly. Places with multiple buried histories punish haste. They reward the visitor or reader who understands that one compelling story may have settled on top of another, more quietly effaced one. In Salem, the surface has become famous. The buried layers still ask to be acknowledged, even when they cannot be narrated with the same documentary fullness. If the witch trial story teaches anything, it is that a society can become dangerous when it believes only the evidence that fits its existing frame. Salem's longer land history asks for the opposite discipline, to remain aware that the frame itself arrived late, and that beneath its boards, older realities continue to hold the weight of everything built above them. 14. Hawthorne, inheritance, and the moral fog that never quite lifted. It is difficult to leave Salem without passing through Nathaniel Hawthorne, not because his life explains the town, but because he seemed to understand what the town would become in the American imagination. He was born there. He absorbed its old wood, its harbor weather, its family shadows, its inherited embarrassments. He belonged to a Salem that had already moved beyond the 17th century and yet had not escaped it. In Hawthorne, the town found a writer capable of translating local moral residue into national literature. Hawthorne's importance lies not only in specific plots or buildings associated with him, though those matter. It lies in tone. He knew how to write the feeling that wrongdoing does not disappear simply because the event itself has ended. Sin, shame, secrecy, inheritance, and delayed consequence haunt his work not as theatrical devices but as structures of experience. Salem had trained him well for that. It was a town where history clung. The connection is more than atmospheric. Hawthorne was descended from one of the judges connected to the trials, a fact that later readers have often treated as psychologically decisive. Whether one wants to dramatize that lineage or approach it more cautiously, it remains meaningful that one of America's great writers of moral burden came from a place where public injustice had entered family memory. Salem did not simply give Hawthorne scenery. It gave him an inheritance difficult to look at directly. That inheritance appears again and again in his sensibility. He is interested in old houses, hidden faults, inherited stain, and the strange way a community can preserve the shell of respectability around a core of unresolved wrong. Such themes do not belong exclusively to Salem, of course, but Salem offered a concrete civic lesson in how the past lingers structurally. You can rebuild trade, restore buildings, change generations, and still not entirely free a town from the moral weather set by earlier acts. Hawthorne belongs in Salem's story without reducing Salem to literature. He is not simply the famous local author added for prestige. He is one of the clearest interpreters of what makes the town enduringly uncanny. The uncanniness is not ghost light. It is ethical persistence. It is the sense that certain places continue to exhale consequences after the original actors are gone. The custom house, the waterfront, the old dwellings, the inherited names. Hawthorne moved among all of these. He knew Salem as a working place, not as a historical theme park. That gives his intuition special weight. He understood that the town's darkness was braided with ordinary civic life. Trade happened. Families aged, houses decayed and were repaired. Officials did their jobs. Meanwhile, the old moral fog never quite lifted. It thinned. It shifted. It attached itself to architecture and reputation and literary memory. But it remained. Perhaps Salem in Hawthorne's wake became more than a local cautionary tale. It became part of the American method of thinking about guilt. Not simply individual guilt, but inherited guilt. What a later generation does with the knowledge that its institutions, families, or hometowns once aligned themselves with cruelty or cowardice. Hawthorne does not offer easy absolution. He offers atmosphere thick enough to make evasion uncomfortable. Atmosphere, in Salem, is never trivial. The town's power depends on it because so much of its history concerns what cannot be fully repaired. The dead can be named, memorials can be built, records can be digitized, sites can be corrected. Yet some remainder always stays behind. The knowledge that the community itself generated the wrong. The knowledge that posterity understands what contemporaries refuse to see. The knowledge that prosperity, refinement, and later literary accomplishment do not undo earlier moral failure. Hawthorne wrote in that remainder. He also helps explain why Salem's endings tend to widen rather than close. A simple historical narrative wants a conclusion. The panic passed, the court dissolved, apologies came, memory remained. Hawthorne's Salem resists that closure. It says the end of an event is not the end of its operation inside culture. The moral pressure can settle into houses, names, and self-understanding for generations. History becomes weather. Consider how perfectly that weather suits Salem itself. Fog over harbor water, salt on old timber, narrow streets opening onto preserved facades, a memorial in a residential neighborhood. A family burial tradition held close where the archive grows thin. Hawthorne did not invent the conditions. He recognized their emotional grammar. He heard the way the town carried consequence in low tones. Invoking him should never feel like a detour. He is part of Salem's mechanism. He shows how a place's local tensions become a national symbolic resource. Through him, Salem's particularities entered the larger American mind as questions about conscience, inherited stain, and the difficulty of cleansing public memory. Once that happened, the town no longer belonged only to Massachusetts history. It belonged to the imagination of a country trying repeatedly to decide what to do with its own moral residue. Perhaps that is Salem's most Hawthornian quality of all, the refusal to let the visible present claim innocence simply because it arrived later. Modern Salem may be kinder than 17th century Salem, more self-aware, more historically corrective, more open to public mourning. Yet it still lives with the old names, the old architecture, the old stories, the old economic overlays, the old literary shadows. It cannot begin fresh. It can only inherit more consciously. There is a tenderness in that too. A town need not escape its past entirely to handle it better. Sometimes maturity lies in carrying memory honestly rather than pretending the weather has changed when it has only become easier to name. Hawthorne, for all his darkness, helps point toward that form of honesty. He knew that to inherit is not necessarily to repeat, but neither is it to forget. If Salem ever feels wrapped in a moral fog, that is because the place has become expert at surviving inside partial visibility. It knows some things clearly now that it once did not. It has corrected some stories, preserved some sites, opened some records, and honored some names more carefully. Yet the full human cost of what happened there, and of everything later built on top of it, still cannot be made fully transparent. Hawthorne would have understood that. He might even have said transparency is not how such places work. They work through residue. So when we pass through Hawthorne on our way toward the end of Salem's story, we are really passing through one of the town's truest interpreters, a man who recognized that history can become mood, mood can become architecture, and architecture can become conscience. Salem gave him its materials. He gave Salem a language it continues to live inside. 15. The town after midnight, the town beneath the name. By now, the familiar Salem has likely grown less stable than it first appeared. The neat image has opened into multiple rooms. There is the village under strain and the harbor reaching outward. There are paper records and burial traditions. There is Proctor's Ledge correcting Gallows Hill. There is Rebecca Nurse returning, perhaps in secret, to family ground. There is Giles Corey under stones and then under legend. There are shipbuilders, merchants, and counting houses facing the sea. There is Hawthorne receiving the town's old moral fog and turning it into literature. There is the modern city selling one version of itself while quieter versions wait underneath. Still, Salem is not exhausted. Perhaps it cannot be exhausted because the town's central mystery is not any one event, but the way events settle into place and keep changing meaning. America has many old towns. Few have become so synonymous with one crisis. Fewer still have watched that crisis pull every surrounding layer into its gravity without fully erasing them. Salem's history is like harbor mist drifting through timbered rooms. It softens edges, but it also reveals depth by concealing it imperfectly. If you imagine the town after midnight, much of what dominates daylight begins to quiet. The branded Salem recedes. The decorative Salem dims. What remains is a landscape of residual truths, a memorial wall in stillness. A house by the harbor holding more centuries than any one story can fully animate. A family cemetery where devotion may have corrected public disgrace in darkness. Old waterfront stones that remember trade better than they remember tourism. Streets that once carried judicial urgency, now carrying only wind. In that quieter hour, the question shifts. It is no longer what happened in Salem. That question has answers, however partial. The deeper question becomes, what kind of place does a town become after it has been remade by its own memory? Salem's answer is neither simple triumph nor perpetual curse. It is something more American and more complicated than that. The town becomes an argument with itself. It becomes a site where evidence and myth compete, where preservation and performance coexist, where inherited shame and civic interpretation keep circling one another without final resolution. This circling is not failure. It may be the only honest condition available. A place marked so deeply by wrongful accusation cannot simply convert itself into purity by apologizing later or building memorials, however necessary those acts may be. Nor should it surrender to voyeuristic spectacle, however profitable that may prove in the short term. Instead, it must keep revisiting its own layers, correcting where possible, naming where possible, and admitting uncertainty where certainty would only repeat the old violence in a softer form. Salem at its best now seems to understand that. The town cannot control every fantasy projected onto it, but it can continue to offer deeper forms of attention. It can preserve the records. It can protect the homestead. It can mark the ledge. It can keep the harbor story alive beside the trial story. It can allow literature, architecture, and scholarship to complicate the commercial image rather than vanish beneath it. This does not solve the town. It honors it. What, finally, does Salem honor when it does these things? Not witchcraft as entertainment, not darkness as style. It honors the difficult truth that places are made of more than the stories people repeat most easily. It honors the dead by naming them more carefully than the court named their supposed crimes. It honors the living by refusing to pretend a community is ever safest when it feels most certain. It honors history by allowing the ground, the archive, and the old wood to correct the louder imagination. There is a kind of tenderness in that correction. For all Salem's notoriety, the town's later life contains repeated attempts to behave more gently toward its own past than its ancestors did, to read more carefully, to mourn more exactly, to distinguish legend from record without scorning why legend arose, to widen the frame so that the trials do not swallow every other Salem whole. That gentleness feels earned. It is the opposite of the courtroom. Mystery remains. It remains in the body that may have been carried home by night. It remains in the phrase attached to a dying man whose final words are remembered more cleanly than proven. It remains in the older ground beneath the colonial story. It remains in the tension between public brand and buried complexity. It remains in the way some houses survive to bear meaning, while other spaces must be reconstructed only in thought. It remains in the simple fact that knowing more about Salem rarely makes the place feel smaller. It makes it feel deeper. This may be why Salem continues to draw people who are not satisfied with the first explanation. The town rewards second looks, third looks. It rewards anyone willing to ask not only what happened, but what else the famous happening obscured. It rewards patience over appetite, listening over performance. In a culture often addicted to the quick summary, Salem insists on layers. If you stand on the waterfront and look back toward town, you can almost see those layers stacked against one another. Maritime ambition, Puritan severity, literary afterlife, historic preservation, memorial grief, corrective scholarship, memorial grief. The living city moving through all of it. From that angle, Salem stops being a singular cautionary tale and becomes something more expansive, a model for how places carry contradictory inheritances without ever reducing them to one moral. Stand inland, in the quieter spaces associated with the trials, the lesson changes but deepens. Here the town reminds you that fear is most dangerous when institutions love certainty more than truth. It reminds you that a community can write down its errors and still call them justice. It reminds you that later memory, no matter how sincere, is always working after damage, never before it. The ledge, the cemetery, the records, the names. They all say the same thing in different forms. Attention came too late for those who needed it most. Perhaps that is the softest and heaviest truth in Salem. The place we now approach as an archive of warning was once simply a community moving through its own present, convinced enough of itself to become cruel. That is what gives the town its lasting force. The danger was ordinary before it became historical. The buildings were ordinary. The roads were ordinary. The arguments were ordinary. The season's hardship was ordinary, in the grim way hardship often is. And then, through a terrible combination of belief, pressure, and procedure, the ordinary world made room for the irreversible. The modern town cannot undo that, but it can keep refusing the simplifications that made such room easier to accept. It can keep saying that Salem is not only a place where witches were imagined, but a place where evidence was mishandled, where divisions were inflamed, where weather and war and doctrine and law pressed too closely together, where families carried private grief, where prosperity later rose beside remembered shame, where literature preserved moral residue, and where the ground itself sometimes had to be asked again what really happened there. With the town settling into its last quiet shape tonight, perhaps the best way to leave Salem is not with a shock, but with a widening. The realization that America's forgotten mysteries are often not forgotten because no record exists. They are forgotten because one louder story stands at the surface and hides the older, deeper, stranger layers below. Salem is one of those places. Beneath the name almost everyone recognizes lies a more patient landscape of buried claims, corrected maps, uneasy inheritances, harbor routes, family devotion, and memorial truth. The bells are quieter now. The harbor water has darkened into one long band. The wood in the old houses has cooled. The last footsteps on the street have begun to thin. Somewhere beyond the bright version of Salem, the deeper town remains as it has for centuries. Part archive, part warning, part unresolved conversation between land and memory. Listen for it very gently. You can hear what the town has been saying all along. That the visible place is never the whole place. That the story most repeated is rarely the deepest one. That beneath courtrooms there are fields. Beneath legends there are records. Beneath records there are silences. Beneath the tourist city there is an older port. Beneath the colonial town there is older ground still. And beneath all of it there is the persistent human desire to make sense of fear by naming it badly. Salem survived that desire, though many within it did not. What remains now is not a solved mystery, but a layered one. A town that keeps asking to be read more carefully. A town whose best truths live just below the familiar surface. A town that, once the loudness drains away, becomes less a spectacle of witchcraft than a quiet lesson in how history settles into wood, water, paper, and stone. So let the name loosen a little. Let the famous image drift outward. Let the deeper Salem come forward in its place. Slower, sadder, wider, and more human than the legend ever was. And let it rest there, in that softer focus, as harbor air moves across the town and the old layers keep their watch beneath the night. 16. After the court fell silent. It is easy to narrate the Salem trials as though the story ends when the executions stop. That is the shape many histories naturally take. The panic rises, the accusations multiply, the court acts, the deaths occur, doubt grows, procedure changes, and eventually the machinery comes to rest. But for the people who had to keep living there, the end of the court could not possibly have felt like the end of the event. It would only have been the beginning of another, more difficult chapter. The chapter in which a community had to face what it had done without yet having a language adequate to that realization. What does a village feel like after fear loses confidence? What does a town sound like when the names spoken with certainty now hang in the air with a different weight? There is no single answer preserved cleanly in the archive. But the question matters, because the aftermath of Salem is one of its least discussed and most human mysteries. Public memory tends to dwell on accusation because accusation is dramatic. The slow return of doubt is quieter, less theatrical, and in some ways more devastating. Imagine the practical reality first. The prison spaces that had filled with the accused would not suddenly empty the mind merely because legal momentum changed. Families had been broken apart. Labor had been interrupted. Property had been unsettled. Children had watched adults behave in ways adults would later have to reckon with. Households had listened as neighbors became enemies, and then, perhaps, neighbors again in public form, if not in trust. The panic had turned community into a field of moral debris. Now imagine the spiritual reality. A culture convinced for months that it was confronting hidden diabolic assault would now have to confront something far more difficult. The possibility that the hidden thing was not witchcraft at all, but the community's own capacity for error, fear, and cruelty. That is a much harder revelation to organize theologically. It is easier to preach against the devil than against one's own recent certainty. One reason Salem's aftermath could never have been emotionally neat. Official reversals and later apologies matter, but they do not immediately settle the interior damage. The people released from prison could return home, but return did not erase memory. Families of the dead could remember innocence more openly, but remembrance is not restoration. Ministers and magistrates could regret particular proceedings, but regret does not rewind procedure. A town can abandon a panic and still remain structured by the shape the panic gave to relationships. There is a particular sadness in thinking about how ordinary spaces must have changed meaning afterward. The meeting house, the road to town, the fields around a family property, a doorway where an arrest had begun, a room where accusations were first discussed, the threshold of a house from which someone was taken away. Such places do not become neutral again quickly. Memory lingers locally. Salem today is filled with commemorative sites, but the first memorials would have been private and invisible. The places people could no longer pass without remembering who stood there and what was said. Perhaps that is why later physical memorials matter so much. They externalize what private memory could not permanently bear alone. A wall with names, a homestead preserved, a cemetery attended, a corrected execution site marked. These later acts of public memory do, in visible form, what the first survivors could only do inwardly or within family circles. They move grief from silence into place. Before that visible memory came years of slower adjustment. Trust would have changed shape. So would authority. Once a court proves itself capable of terrible injustice, its future commands cannot sound exactly as they once did. Once a minister's warnings have aligned with devastation, his words acquire a different aftertaste. Even if some people resisted the panic all along and others embraced it reluctantly, the community as a whole would still have had to live under the knowledge that it had crossed certain lines together. That may be one reason Salem remained morally productive in literature and public imagination. The trials did not merely produce victims and perpetrators. They produced aftermath, an atmosphere of unresolved inheritance. Communities can sometimes survive their own wrongdoing by refusing to think deeply about it. Salem never had that luxury. The event was too public, too documented, too deadly, too singular. The town's name carried the burden forward, whether residents wished it to or not. There is also the matter of time. In the immediate aftermath, some people would have sought explanation in one register, others in another. A few might have doubled down. Some might have chosen strategic silence. Some might have felt genuine repentance. Some might have preferred to think of the whole episode as a confusion best left undescribed. Human beings are rarely morally synchronized. A town recovering from collective failure does not awaken one morning with a single shared conscience. It fractures further, then slowly composes a new public language over old private divisions. Gradually, a new language in Salem emerged gradually through acts of acknowledgement, reinterpretation, and memorialization across generations. Which means the aftermath of 1692 did not really end in the 1690s. It became an intergenerational process. Descendants inherited stories, silences, stains, and contested emphases. Some names drew sympathy. Others drew discomfort. Some documents remained. Some feelings perhaps survived only in family habits of what was or was not discussed aloud. Intergenerational afterlife is part of what makes Salem more than an event site. It is a memory site, a place where the question of how to remember became almost as important as the original facts remembered. Different eras answered that question differently. Some moralized, some romanticized, some commercialized, some studied, some preserved, some corrected. All of them, in their own way, participated in the long aftermath of the court's silence. Even the architecture of Salem can be read through this lens. Old houses are not simply survivors from an earlier period. They are containers that outlived the panic and therefore had to absorb its memory into later normality. People kept sleeping, eating, working, trading, writing, grieving, and aging in the shadow of what had occurred. The harbor continued. Commerce continued. Weather continued. Daily life resumed, as daily life always does. Yet resumption is not innocence. It is only motion after rupture. If we listen carefully, one of Salem's quietest truths is that history rarely ends where a textbook chapter ends. It lingers in altered expectations. A generation learns not to trust authority quite the same way. A family learns to carry the name of one of the accused or one of the judges with a different posture. A community becomes known beyond itself for something it did not choose to become famous for, and later inhabitants spend centuries negotiating whether that fame is burden, warning, resource, or all three at once. That last point matters more than it first seems. Salem's modern identity depends partly on the fact that the town did not get to leave its own event behind. The event attached itself permanently to the name. In that sense, the aftermath is still active. The town continues to be asked the same questions in new forms. What really happened? Who gets remembered? What is legend? What is record? How should tragedy be presented? What else does the name Salem obscure? These are aftermath questions, and they remain alive because the court's silence was never the final silence. A deeper kindness enters the story here too. Communities that endure moral catastrophe sometimes develop, over long periods, unusually sensitive practices of remembrance. Not always, but sometimes. Salem's later care with archives, memorials, preserved houses, and historical correction suggests a town trying, however imperfectly, to become more responsible toward its own past than it once was toward its living members. There is no full repair in that. But there is a sort of civic maturation. Still, sorrow remains irreducible. 25 innocent women, men, and children died across the crisis from 1692 into 1693. Most were hanged. Giles Corey was pressed. Some died in prison. No amount of later interpretive sophistication should soften that core reality. The aftermath matters not because it redeems the catastrophe, but because it reveals what a place does once redemption proves impossible. Salem's answer has been layered, unfinished, and sometimes contradictory. Yet perhaps contradiction is exactly the right register. A town can mourn sincerely and still market itself clumsily. It can preserve truth and still simplify it for convenience. It can correct historical error and still remain partially trapped by older myth. It can become wiser without becoming pure. Salem contains all of that. To walk through the town now is therefore to move through centuries of ongoing response. The memorials are response. The museums are response. The archive is response. The ghost tours, strangely enough, are also response, though not always the most careful kind. Even the visitor's own curiosity is response. Everyone who comes to Salem arrives inside the long wake of the court's failure. Deepest of all, the response may simply be this, to lower the voice, to become more exact, to let the place be more complicated than one first expected. That is how a town begins to recover dignity, not by escaping the event that marked it, but by refusing the false certainties that made such an event possible and the false simplicities that later fame encourages. 17. A final slow walk through the layered town. Before we leave Salem tonight, it may help to walk through it once more, not in the quick order of a guidebook, but in the slower order the place itself seems to prefer. First, the water. Harbor water gathering the last of the light, reminding us that Salem was always more outward-looking than its most famous story suggests. Ships once moved from this port toward a wider world, carrying goods, risk, ambition, and the practical intelligence of a maritime town. Counting houses turned movement into numbers. Builders shaped timber into vessels that traveled farther than many people now associate with Salem at all. Before the modern town sold its darkness, the harbor sold its skill. The houses. Old wood holding weather in its grain. The House of the Seven Gables standing not as a spooky set piece, but as the remnant of mercantile success that later generations wrapped in literary unease. Rooms once built for commerce and domestic life becoming vessels of memory, then symbols, then preserved institutions. A house is never only a house in Salem. It becomes a way the past keeps occupying the visible world. Further inland, the village spaces and inland quiet. The farms. The old social distances between Salem town and Salem Village. The sense that the land itself once taught different rhythms to different parts of the community. Harbor reach on one side, agricultural tension on the other. Prosperity in one register, vulnerability in another. No town is simple when its geography teaches contrary ways of belonging. Within the meeting house world, where doctrine and discipline were meant to sustain order but became entangled with grievance, ambition, fear, and the dangerous conviction that invisible evil could be detected and purified. A room built for worship can become, under pressure, a chamber where certainty sharpens instead of softens. Salem knew that transformation too well. Inside the legal rooms, though many no longer survive physically in the forms one might wish. The tables, the examinations, the warrants, the folded papers, the clerical calm with which panic entered procedure. Fear learned to use paper there, and once it did, accusation acquired a future. The record still sits with us because the bureaucracy of injustice wrote itself down so thoroughly. In the prison spaces, imagine now through what the documents cannot fully hold. The waiting, the damp, the uncertainty, the bodies growing weak while the public story outside continued to gather force. Some of the accused would never return. Some returned altered. Some died before verdict could even settle around them. The town we remember for its names is also a town that contained long hours of waiting no memorial can entirely restore, among the places of singular grief. The Rebecca Nurse homestead, where land, house, meeting house memory, and cemetery join into one of Salem's most intimate moral landscapes. There, the possibility of a body carried home in secret remains suspended between family tradition and documentary limit, a mystery, not of spectacle, but of devotion. There, the public catastrophe becomes household sorrow. At Proctor's Ledge, at the base of Gallows Hill, the place the landscape itself had to teach the public to see more accurately. Not the grand dramatic summit many imagined, but the truer ledge where 19 people were executed and are now named with a sobriety the old court denied them. There, the town's later conscience speaks most clearly in simple words: we remember. With Giles Corey in the field beside the jail, the old man underweight, refusing a process he understood too well. Around him gather all the questions Salem leaves unresolved: how law becomes cruelty, how legend forms around suffering, how a phrase can live longer than its proof, how a body can reveal the exact point where a community's moral order has failed beyond rhetoric. Behind it all, the larger weather. The frontier wars murmuring through rumor and refugee memory. The smallpox. The cold. The dry seasons. The political instability after charter troubles. The widened sense that the world itself had become precarious. Salem did not invent fear from nothing. It inherited pressure and then named it disastrously. Afterward, the aftermath. The courts falling quiet. The community continuing. The dead remaining dead. The surviving learning the slower disciplines of living with what could no longer be denied. The town becoming, across decades and centuries, an argument over how exactly to remember itself. Through Hawthorne, inheriting not only structures and family names but moral weather, he understood that Salem's true darkness was not costume or ghostlight. It was consequence, residue, the inability of wrongdoing to stay politely in the century where it occurred. Through him, the town's local burden entered the wider American imagination as a lesson in how shame settles into architecture and bloodline and civic mood. On the modern streets, where the Salem that sells and the Salem that waits beneath it coexist uneasily. Here memory becomes industry, but not only industry. Here scholarship pushes back. Here preserved spaces ask for seriousness. Here visitors arrive expecting one story and, if they are patient, begin discovering several others threaded beneath it. Below even all of these, older ground still. The land before the colonial frame, the prior presences not fully held in the English record, the deeper reminder that no famous town begins where its most marketable archive begins. Salem's layers descend farther than many of its own stories admit. When you place all of this together, the town becomes less a single mystery than a pattern of mysteries nested inside one another. The visible Salem conceals a deeper Salem, and that deeper Salem conceals older ground still. The public story points one way, the archive another, the memorial another, the harbor another. None cancels the rest. They accumulate. This accumulation is why Salem can never be reduced to the phrase most commonly attached to it. Yes, the witch trials define the town's name in the global imagination. But the longer one stays, the more the name itself begins to feel too small for what it contains. Salem is a place where American fears, ambitions, institutions, myths, and revisions became unusually concentrated. A place where the costs of certainty were written down and where the later ethics of correction had to be learned piece by piece. If there is a comfort in all this, it is not the comfort of innocence regained. Salem does not offer that. Its comfort, if one can call it that, lies in the possibility of more careful reading. The town that once mishandled evidence now teaches the value of handling evidence slowly. The place that once acted too quickly now rewards delay, patience, and second looks. The landscape that was once spoken over now sometimes corrects the story told about it. There is a quiet dignity in that reversal. Perhaps the gentlest way to close is simply to let Salem remain layered, not solved, not purified, not flattened into one moral or one marketable image. Let the harbor keep its breadth. Let the ledge keep its names. Let the homestead keep its tender uncertainty. Let the old houses keep their inherited hush. Let the archive keep both its precision and its gaps. Let Hawthorne keep his fog. Let the older ground remain beneath the colonial story like a truth too deep for slogans. Finally, the town can settle into its proper scale. Not a cartoon of witchcraft, not merely a scene of panic, but a human place where fear, memory, commerce, architecture, weather, law, and mourning all left their marks in overlapping forms. By now, the streets are nearly empty. The bells are distant. Harbor water moves without explanation. Window glass reflects only darkness and a few softened lights. Somewhere the old timber in an attic adjusts to the night air. Somewhere a memorial stone is unread in the dark, but no less present for being unseen. Somewhere beyond the public route, a cemetery keeps its hush over names that no court had the right to define. Beneath everything, the deeper Salem remains. The one most people miss at first. The one that asks not for excitement, but for patience. The one that reveals, slowly, that America's forgotten mysteries are often not missing at all. They are simply buried beneath the story everyone already thinks they know.